Have you ever wondered what untold secrets might be hidden in the classified files of America's most controversial war? What if I told you that deep in the jungles of Vietnam, a single map carried by a Native American scout contained information so extraordinary that it fundamentally altered U.S. military strategy and may have changed the course of the entire conflict? The story I'm about to share has remained buried in classified documents for decades, a tale of ancient tracking techniques, mysterious cultural knowledge, and a profound connection to the land that even the most sophisticated military technology couldn't replicate. Before we continue with this remarkable story, take a moment to share in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe these hidden chapters of American military history deserve to be brought into the light, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering these extraordinary stories that have been concealed from the public for far too long. It was the summer of 1968, a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War. American forces were struggling against an enemy that seemed to materialize from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. The dense jungles, labyrinthine tunnel systems, and unfamiliar terrain had neutralized much of the technological advantage that American military planners had counted on. In this environment of mounting frustration, Operation Phantom Trail was conceived, a classified initiative to incorporate specialized reconnaissance personnel with unique skills suited to the challenging environment. Among the men selected for this program was Sergeant Joseph Tallfeather, a 32-year-old Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Tallfeather was no ordinary soldier. Before his military service, he had been recognized within his community as a gifted tracker, having learned traditional skills from his grandfather, a respected elder who had served as a scout for the U.S. Army decades earlier during the final conflicts of the frontier era. Joe could read the land in ways that seemed almost supernatural, recalled Lieutenant Thomas Merrick, who commanded Tallfeather's reconnaissance unit. He could look at a patch of jungle that appeared completely undisturbed to the rest of us and tell you exactly how many people had passed through, how heavily they were loaded down, and how long ago they'd been there. When we asked how he knew these things, he'd just tap his temple and say, "The land speaks to those who know how to listen." Tallfeather's exceptional abilities quickly made him an invaluable asset. Within his first 3 months in country, he had helped locate 5 major Viet Cong supply caches and identified the entrances to 3 tunnel complexes that had eluded previous detection. His methods were unorthodox by military standards. He often insisted on moving alone or with minimal accompaniment, would sometimes stop to examine seemingly insignificant details like the pattern of disturbed insects or the alignment of fallen leaves, and maintained his own system of documentation that few others could comprehend. This personal documentation system would ultimately prove to be of extraordinary significance. Unlike the standard topographical maps used by regular reconnaissance units, Tallfeather maintained what he called his speaking map, a detailed, continuously updated document that combined conventional cartography with symbols, notations, and overlays that incorporated elements from traditional Lakota representational systems. It wasn't just a map in the way we understand maps, explained Dr. Robert Hawkins, a cultural anthropologist who later studied Tallfeather's work. It was more like a dynamic narrative of the landscape, one that recorded not just physical features, but patterns of movement, ecological relationships, and temporal changes. He was essentially creating a document that could capture 4-dimensional information in a 2-dimensional format. Piece. The speaking map became something of a curiosity among the men in Tallfeather's unit. They recognized its effectiveness. Following its guidance had repeatedly led them to significant discoveries, but few understood how he compiled the information or interpreted the complex system of symbols, colors, and annotations that covered its surface. Some of the guys thought it was some kind of Native American magic or something, Lieutenant Merrick noted. But Joe was always clear about it being a system of observation and recording that his people had developed over centuries of reading the land. He didn't mystify it, but he did say that understanding it required a different way of thinking about the relationship between things, how water moves, how plants respond to disturbance, how animals change their behavior in response to human presence. On June 7, 1968, Tallfeather and a small reconnaissance team were operating in the dense jungle of Quang Tri Province, near the Laotian border. Their mission was to investigate reports of increased North Vietnamese army movement in a region where several American patrols had gone missing. It was in this remote area, approximately 15 kilometers west of the fire base at Con Thien, that Tallfeather made the discovery that would eventually reach the highest levels of military command. During a routine observation period, Tallfeather noticed subtle patterns of disturbance in the understory vegetation that suggested recent heavy movement. Following these signs, the team discovered what appeared to be a previously unidentified jungle path. While such discoveries were not uncommon, what happened next was extraordinary. According to debriefing records, Tallfeather spent several hours studying the area, making detailed additions to his map, and then made a startling declaration. "This isn't just a path," he told Lieutenant Merrick. "It's part of something much bigger. There's a whole network here, and it follows the land in a way that makes it almost invisible if you don't know what to look for." When pressed for details, Tallfeather explained that the path was part of an extensive transportation network that operated on principles fundamentally different from conventional military logistics routes. Rather than taking the most direct or efficient path between points, this network followed what Tallfeather described as the natural seams of the landscape, watercourses, ridgelines, transitions between vegetation zones, and other features that minimized visible disturbance and maximized concealment. "The people who made this understand the land in the same way my ancestors did," he explained. "They're not fighting against the terrain. They're letting it guide them, becoming part of it. That's why our aerial surveillance keeps missing these routes. We're looking for straight lines and efficient paths because that's how we build roads. But these people are thinking differently. They're moving like water through the land, following the path of least resistance and greatest concealment." Intrigued but skeptical, Lieutenant Merrick allowed Tallfeather to lead the team along what he claimed was one of these hidden routes. Over the next 3 days, they traced a meandering path that indeed seemed to disappear into the natural features of the landscape at numerous points, only to re-emerge exactly where Tallfeather predicted it would. The route eventually led them to a substantial supply depot cleverly concealed beneath a seemingly natural limestone outcropping, a facility that contained enough ammunition, medical supplies, and preserved food to support multiple battalions. Upon their return to base, Tallfeather spent 2 days completing what would later be known as the Integrated Network Analysis section of his map. Using his unique system of notation, he extrapolated from the segment they had discovered to predict the likely course of the entire transportation network across a region approximately 200 kilometers square. According to his analysis, this wasn't simply a collection of random jungle paths, but a meticulously designed system that mirrored natural patterns of movement through the landscape. When Tallfeather presented his completed work to the intelligence officers at battalion headquarters, the initial response was dismissive. The patterns he had identified didn't align with existing intelligence assessments, and his methodology was considered too unorthodox to be reliable. However, one officer, Major William Gardiner, who had previously worked with indigenous trackers during operations in Malaysia, saw potential value in Tallfeather's approach. "What if he's right?" Gardiner reportedly argued. "Our conventional methods haven't been working. We keep losing track of major enemy movements despite all our technology. Maybe we need to look at this from a completely different perspective." With Gardiner's support, a limited operation was authorized to test Tallfeather's model. 3 reconnaissance teams were dispatched to locations where, according to the speaking map, major junctions in the hidden network should exist. Remarkably, all three teams found evidence supporting Tallfeather's predictions: concealed pathways, camouflaged rest areas, and, in one case, a significant weapons cache. This initial vindication led to a more comprehensive validation effort. Over the next month, dozens of locations identified in Tallfeather's map were investigated. While not every prediction proved perfectly accurate, the overall pattern he had identified was confirmed with sufficient consistency to overcome the initial skepticism. Something extraordinary was happening. A single soldier, using traditional knowledge systems developed thousands of miles away by a culture with no connection to Southeast Asia, had identified patterns that had eluded sophisticated military intelligence operations for years. As word of these discoveries moved up the chain of command, Tallfeather's speaking map was transported under guard to the headquarters of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, in Saigon. There, it underwent intensive analysis by a specialized team that included not only military intelligence officers, but also anthropologists, geographers, and even a mathematician specializing in pattern recognition. What we found when we really examined the map was astonishing, explained Dr. Eleanor Richards, one of the civilian scientists involved in the analysis. Tallfeather had identified what we now understand was an entire alternative transportation infrastructure, one that operated on principles completely different from conventional military logistics. This network didn't just transport supplies and personnel. It was designed to be almost an extension of the natural environment, making it extraordinarily difficult to detect through standard reconnaissance methods. The most remarkable aspect of the discovery wasn't just the network itself, but the principles governing its design. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had developed a system that integrated seamlessly with the natural landscape, using terrain features, vegetation patterns, and seasonal changes to conceal their movements. This approach had effective countermeasures against American technological advantages. The routes minimized heat signatures that might be detected by infrared sensors, utilized natural canopy cover to defeat aerial surveillance, and incorporated natural drainage patterns to disperse evidence of human passage. What made Tallfeather's contribution so valuable was that his traditional knowledge provided a framework for understanding this system. The Lakota traditions of reading the landscape, developed over centuries of living in intimate relationship with the natural environment, gave him a perspective that transcended conventional military thinking. He wasn't just looking for signs of enemy activity. He was understanding the land itself and how people moved through it in harmony with its natural patterns. By late July 1968, Tallfeather's map and analysis had reached the office of General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. Initially skeptical, Westmoreland became convinced of its value after several high-level briefings from the analysis team. The implications were profound. American forces had been operating with a fundamental misunderstanding of how their adversaries navigated and utilized the landscape. The strategic reassessment that followed was sweeping. Traditional interdiction efforts had focused on obvious transportation arteries like the Ho Chi Minh Trail, using massive bombing campaigns and defoliation operations to disrupt enemy supply lines. Tallfeather's work revealed that these efforts, while causing significant damage, were being systematically circumvented by this alternative network that American forces hadn't even recognized existed. "We've been fighting the wrong war," one senior intelligence officer reportedly remarked after reviewing the analysis. "We've been trying to cut their supply lines while missing the actual system they rely on most. It's like we've been focusing on shutting down the highways while they've been moving everything on back roads we can't even see." The immediate operational response was the creation of Task Force Naturalist, a specialized unit combining conventional reconnaissance capabilities with personnel specifically trained to identify and track the patterns Tallfeather had documented. This included recruiting additional indigenous soldiers with traditional tracking backgrounds as well as developing new training protocols for regular reconnaissance teams based on Tallfeather's methods. Sergeant Tallfeather himself was promoted to the rank of Staff Sergeant and assigned as the lead field analyst for the task force. Over the next 6 months, he trained dozens of reconnaissance specialists, conducted numerous field operations to expand and refine his analysis, and continued to develop his mapping methodology. The speaking map evolved from a personal document to the foundation of a new intelligence approach, with elements of its symbology and analytical framework being integrated into standard operating procedures. The impact of this shift was significant but complex. Task Force Naturalist achieved remarkable successes in locating previously undetected enemy facilities and movements. By September 1968, operations based on Tallfeather's methodology had led to the discovery of 27 major supply caches, 15 concealed base areas, and dozens of segments of the hidden transportation network. These discoveries enabled more effective interdiction efforts and provided critical intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. However, the full strategic potential of these insights was constrained by broader political and military realities. By late 1968, American policy was beginning to shift toward the Vietnamization strategy that would eventually lead to U.S. withdrawal. While Tallfeather's work provided valuable tactical advantages, it came too late to fundamentally alter the trajectory of the conflict. Moreover, the very nature of the discovery highlighted the limitations of the American approach to the war. The fact that it took a Native American soldier applying traditional knowledge developed in a completely different context to understand a fundamental aspect of how the Vietnamese forces operated underscored the cultural disconnects that had plagued the American intervention from the beginning. In a way, what Joe discovered was something the Vietnamese already knew intuitively, reflected Lieutenant Merrick years later. They understood their land in the same way that indigenous peoples in America understood theirs, as something you work with rather than against. Our whole approach was about dominating the environment with technology and firepower rather than understanding it. Joe showed us a different way of seeing, but I don't think most of the higher-ups really grasped the deeper implications of that perspective. As 1968 drew to a close, Tallfeather's work had firmly established him as one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the theater. His speaking map had grown to cover an entire wall in the Task Force Naturalist Operations Center, with constant updates and refinements based on new discoveries and changing conditions. Junior officers were routinely brought to view it as part of their orientation, and elements of his analytical approach had been incorporated into training manuals. Yet Tallfeather himself remained somewhat apart from the military establishment, maintaining his distinct cultural perspective, even as his methods were being institutionalized. According to those who worked closely with him, he often expressed concern that the military was focusing too narrowly on the tactical applications of his discoveries, while missing their deeper significance. The network isn't just about moving supplies, he reportedly told Major Gardner during one late-night discussion. It's about a different way of relating to the land. These people move through the jungle like they're part of it, because, in their minds, they are part of it. We keep trying to separate ourselves from the environment to control it from outside. That's why we keep being surprised by what happens here. We're fighting people who don't see a boundary between themselves and this place. This philosophical dimension of Tallfeather's work remains perhaps the most profound and yet least appreciated aspect of his contribution. Beyond the immediate tactical value of his discoveries, he had identified something fundamental about the conflict, a clash not just of military forces or political systems, but of entirely different ways of understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world. As 1969 began, Task Force Naturalist continued to expand its operations, with Tallfeather's methodologies being applied across increasingly large areas of South Vietnam. The speaking map had become an essential intelligence tool, constantly evolving as new information was incorporated and its predictive models refined. Yet even as its military utility was firmly established, questions began to emerge about the deeper implications of what had been discovered. In a classified assessment, dated February 12, 1969, Dr. Richards posed a question that would prove prophetic. If our technological advantages are being systematically neutralized by an approach that works with, rather than against the natural environment, what does this suggest about the fundamental viability of our strategy? Are we attempting to impose a model of warfare that is fundamentally misaligned with the realities of this landscape and the people who inhabit it? Such questions would ultimately remain unanswered as political developments overtook military considerations. By mid-1969, the Nixon administration's commitment to gradual withdrawal was becoming clear, and the emphasis was shifting toward enabling South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting. The innovations developed through Tall Feather's work were incorporated into this transition, but their full potential was never realized within the context of direct American involvement. Tall Feather himself completed his tour of duty in August 1969 and returned to the United States. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device and the Legion of Merit for his contributions, though the classified nature of his work meant that the full extent of his impact remained unknown to the public. Upon his return to civilian life, he became an advocate for indigenous veterans and worked to preserve traditional knowledge within his community. The Speaking Map, that extraordinary document that had changed the way American forces understood the conflict, remained classified for decades. Portions of it were incorporated into military intelligence training programs, particularly those focused on unconventional warfare and counterinsurgency operations. Its influence could be detected in the evolution of reconnaissance doctrine throughout the 1970s and beyond, though often without acknowledgement of its indigenous origins. It wasn't until 2006 that a heavily redacted version of the Task Force Naturalist final report was declassified, providing the first public glimpses of Tall Feather's remarkable work. Even then, the full Speaking Map remained classified, with only selected segments and analytical summaries being released. These fragments, however, were enough to attract the attention of military historians and cultural anthropologists who recognized the significance of what had been discovered. What Tall Feather accomplished was a form of cross-cultural translation at the most profound level, noted Dr. Michael Running Wolf, a Native American scholar who has studied the available documents. He was able to recognize patterns in a completely unfamiliar environment because he understood something fundamental about how humans interact with landscapes, knowledge that had been preserved in Lakota traditions despite centuries of displacement and oppression. In a very real sense, he was drawing on an indigenous way of knowing that predated and transcended the Western military paradigm. This perspective highlights perhaps the most significant aspect of the story: the validation of indigenous knowledge systems in a context where they would typically be dismissed as primitive or superstitious. Tall Feather's success demonstrated that traditional ecological knowledge, developed through generations of close observation and relationship with the land, could provide insights that the most sophisticated technology might miss. For the military establishment, the lessons were primarily tactical and methodological. Elements of Tall Feather's approach were incorporated into special operations training, reconnaissance procedures, and intelligence analysis frameworks. The experience influenced the development of tracking programs within elite units and contributed to a greater emphasis on understanding the environmental and cultural contexts of conflict zones. But, for indigenous communities, particularly veterans who had served in Vietnam, the story represented something more profound, a recognition of the value and validity of traditional knowledge in the modern world. As word of Tall Feather's contributions gradually spread through veteran networks and indigenous communities, it became a source of pride and validation. "What Joe did over there wasn't just good soldiering," explained Richard Two Bulls, a fellow Lakota veteran who served in Vietnam around the same time as Tall Feather. "He showed them that our ways of knowing the land, ways they tried to beat out of us for generations in those boarding schools, had real power. He used knowledge that goes back thousands of years to see what all their fancy technology couldn't show them. That matters. It tells us something important about what was lost and what might still be recovered. Joseph Tallfeather's return to civilian life in the autumn of 1969 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of the speaking map, one characterized by institutional resistance, gradual recognition, and ultimately a profound reassessment of indigenous knowledge in military contexts. While his direct involvement with military operations had concluded, the impact of his work continued to reverberate through both official channels and more personal connections. Upon his discharge, Tallfeather was approached by representatives from several intelligence agencies who recognized the potential applications of his methodology beyond the specific context of Vietnam. He was offered positions as a consultant and trainer with substantial financial incentives. According to those close to him, he declined these offers, expressing concern about how his knowledge might be applied and a desire to return to his community. Joe felt that what he had shared had already been misunderstood in fundamental ways, explained his cousin, Michael Tallfeather, in a 2011 interview. He said the military wanted to turn his way of reading the land into just another weapon, another tool of control. But for him, it was about relationship and understanding, not domination. He didn't want to see something sacred to our people turned into just another tactic. Instead, Tallfeather returned to the Pine Ridge Reservation, where he worked as a tribal ranger and later as a cultural liaison with the National Park Service. He became an advocate for indigenous veterans, helping to establish support networks for those returning from Vietnam and working to ensure that their unique experiences and needs were recognized. He spoke rarely about his specific contributions to the war effort, bound both by security classifications and his own reluctance to revisit those experiences. Meanwhile, within military and intelligence circles, the legacy of the speaking map followed a complex trajectory. Task Force Naturalist continued to operate until the drawdown of American combat forces in 1972, gradually transferring its methodologies and findings to South Vietnamese counterparts. The effectiveness of this transfer was limited by cultural and institutional barriers, with American advisors struggling to convey the nuanced integration of traditional knowledge and modern intelligence techniques that had made Tallfeather's approach so valuable. In Washington, analysis of the speaking map and its implications continued under the auspices of various classified programs. The map itself was physically transferred to a secure facility at the Pentagon in 1970, where it was studied by specialists from multiple agencies. This analysis produced what became known as the Naturalist Protocols, a series of methodological guidelines for environmental intelligence gathering that incorporated elements of Tallfeather's approach while detaching them from their indigenous cultural context. What happened to Tallfeather's work is, in many ways, emblematic of how indigenous knowledge has historically been treated, observed Dr. Catherine Whitefeather, a military historian and member of the Crow Nation. The technical elements were extracted and incorporated into Western frameworks, while the philosophical foundation, the actual worldview that made those techniques meaningful and effective, was largely ignored or minimized. It was a form of intellectual colonization that mirrored the physical colonization of indigenous lands. This selective incorporation was evident in how the naturalist protocols were implemented in subsequent military operations and training programs. The emphasis was placed on observable techniques and pattern recognition methodologies rather than the underlying perspective that connected these elements. Tracking courses established at special operations training facilities taught trainees how to identify the kinds of subtle environmental indicators that Tallfeather had recognized, but rarely addressed the relational understanding of landscapes that had allowed him to interpret these signs within a coherent system. By the mid-1970s, with the Vietnam War concluded and military priorities shifting, Direct reference to the speaking map and its origins began to fade from operational documents. Elements of the methodology survived in various specialized training programs and reconnaissance protocols, but often without acknowledgement of their source. The classified status of the original materials further obscured the indigenous contributions to these developments. This institutional forgetting might have been complete if not for the efforts of a few key individuals who recognized the significance of what had been discovered. Major William Gardner, who had been among the first to champion Tallfeather's approach, continued to advocate for greater integration of indigenous perspectives in military environmental analysis throughout his subsequent career. After his retirement in 1982, he began a careful campaign to ensure that Tallfeather's contributions would eventually receive appropriate recognition. Working within the constraints of security classifications, Gardner established connections with academic researchers studying traditional ecological knowledge and its applications. While never directly revealing classified information, he helped create intellectual frameworks that would eventually allow for the proper contextualizing of Tallfeather's work once declassification occurred. These efforts laid the groundwork for the eventual re-evaluation of the speaking map and its significance. Simultaneously, among indigenous veterans, especially those who had served in reconnaissance roles, awareness of Tallfeather's contributions was preserved through informal networks and oral traditions. Stories about the Lakota tracker who had seen what no one else could see became part of the shared narrative of Native American service in Vietnam. These accounts, while often lacking specific details due to security restrictions, kept the essence of the achievement alive within communities that understood its deeper cultural significance. We all heard about Joe and his map, recalled Thomas Standing Bear, an Oglala Lakota veteran who served in the 1st Cavalry Division. The details were fuzzy. No one knew exactly what he'd done because it was all classified. But we knew it was something important, something that had shown the brass that our traditional ways had value they couldn't get from all their technology. That meant something to us, especially at a time when we were still being told that our culture was backward and needed to be left behind. It wasn't until the early 1990s, as part of the broader reassessment of the Vietnam conflict that characterized that period, that official reconsideration of Tallfeather's contribution began in earnest. In 1993, a special review panel examining historically significant intelligence operations recommended the partial declassification of materials related to Task Force Naturalist, citing both historical value and the potential for derived methodologies to inform contemporary operations. The first limited declassification occurred in 1995, releasing heavily redacted versions of some Task Force Naturalist operational reports and analytical summaries. These materials, while fragmentary, provided the first official confirmation of what had previously existed primarily as rumor and legend within indigenous veteran communities. They revealed the existence and basic parameters of the speaking map, though the map itself and most specific details of its methodology remained classified. This partial revelation coincided with Joseph Tallfeather's declining health. Diagnosed with cancer in 1994, he spent his final years working with family members and trusted friends to preserve what he could of his knowledge in culturally appropriate ways. He remained bound by security classifications regarding specific operational details, but spoke more openly about the philosophical foundations of his approach and his hopes for how it might eventually be understood. What I want people to understand is that this wasn't about me being special or having some magical power, he explained in a video interview recorded by his nephew in 1996. It was about a way of seeing and knowing that our people developed over thousands of years of living in relationship with the land. In Vietnam, I was able to see what others couldn't, because I had been taught to look at the world as a web of relationships, rather than a collection of separate objects. The map worked because it captured those relationships, rather than just marking locations. Tallfeather passed away in January 1997. His funeral at Pine Ridge drew hundreds of attendees, including numerous indigenous veterans, several former members of Task Force Naturalist, and even a few senior military officers who attended unofficially to pay their respects. Major Gardner, by then retired for 15 years, delivered one of the eulogies, speaking of Tallfeather's profound contribution to our understanding of how to read the language of the land. Following his death, efforts to secure fuller recognition of his contributions accelerated. The Native American Veterans Association, working with sympathetic members of Congress, pressed for greater declassification of materials related to his work. Academic researchers in fields ranging from military history to indigenous studies began exploring the implications of what was already known about the speaking map, developing theoretical frameworks that would eventually help contextualize the full scope of the achievement. A significant breakthrough came in 2006 with the declassification of the Task Force Naturalist Comprehensive Assessment, which included detailed analyses of the methodological innovations introduced through Tallfeather's work. While still heavily redacted and lacking the map itself, this document provided substantial evidence of the strategic impact of his contributions and the unique nature of his approach. The assessment confirmed what many had long suspected, that Tallfeather's integration of traditional Lakota land reading practices with military intelligence requirements had identified patterns of enemy activity that had eluded conventional analysis for years. It detailed how his methodology had revealed an entire alternative logistics infrastructure that operated on principles fundamentally different from Western military expectations, and how this discovery had forced a significant reevaluation of American strategy. Dr. James Running Water, an anthropologist specializing in indigenous knowledge systems, described the significance of these revelations. What the documents confirmed was that Tallfeather had effectively translated between two entirely different ways of understanding the landscape. He took knowledge developed within a Lakota cultural context, knowledge that emphasized relationship, reciprocity, and integration with natural systems, and applied it to a situation where conventional Western approaches, with their emphasis on domination and control, had proven inadequate. This perspective highlights what may be the most profound aspect of the speaking map's legacy: its demonstration that indigenous knowledge systems, far from being primitive or merely cultural curiosities, could offer sophisticated analytical frameworks capable of addressing complex contemporary challenges. Tallfeather's work represented not just a tactical innovation, but a validation of an entire epistemology that had been systematically marginalized through centuries of colonization. Further declassifications followed gradually over subsequent years, each revealing more details about the map and its impact. In 2011, a major release of previously classified materials included several photographed sections of the speaking map itself, allowing researchers to examine firsthand the unique system of notation and analysis that Tallfeather had developed. These materials confirmed the extraordinary sophistication of his approach and its seamless integration of traditional and contemporary elements. The map sections revealed a system that defied conventional cartographic categories. While built on a standard topographic base, Tallfeather had overlaid this with multiple systems of notation that captured dynamic relationships rather than static features. Seasonal changes, movement patterns, ecological interactions, and temporal rhythms were all represented through an intricate symbology that drew on traditional Lakota representational traditions while incorporating elements necessitated by the specific operational context. It's not just a map in the conventional sense, explained Dr. Eleanor Richards, one of the few surviving members of the original analysis team, in a 2012 interview. It's more like a visual model of a complex adaptive system, one that captures not just what was there, but how it functioned and changed over time. Joe somehow managed to represent four-dimensional relationships in a two-dimensional medium, creating something that was simultaneously a document, a predictive model, and a narrative of the landscape. This unique approach proved particularly valuable in the context of guerrilla warfare, where conventional military intelligence focused primarily on identifying and targeting discrete entities, base areas, supply caches, troop concentrations, often missing the dynamic relationships and patterns of movement that connected these elements. Tallfeather's methodology revealed the negative space of the conflict, the flows and connections that conventional analysis overlooked precisely because they blended so seamlessly with the natural environment. By 2015, sufficient material had been declassified to allow for comprehensive scholarly assessment of Tallfeather's contribution and its significance. Academic studies in fields ranging from military history to indigenous studies began examining the speaking map and its methodology, exploring both its immediate tactical impact and its broader implications for cross-cultural knowledge exchange. These assessments highlighted several key aspects of Tallfeather's achievement. First was his ability to recognize patterns in a completely unfamiliar environment based on principles derived from his Lakota heritage. Despite having no prior experience with Southeast Asian landscapes, he was able to identify environmental relationships that had eluded analysts with years of in-country experience because he understood fundamental principles of how humans integrate with natural systems. Second was the sophisticated synthesis he achieved between traditional knowledge and contemporary operational requirements. The speaking map wasn't simply an application of pre-existing Lakota practices, but a creative integration that developed new methodologies appropriate to the specific context while remaining grounded in traditional principles. This demonstrated the dynamic, adaptive nature of indigenous knowledge systems, their capacity to engage with new challenges rather than being fixed in the past. Perhaps most significantly, Tallfeather's work challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technological advancement and effective intelligence gathering. At a time when American military thinking was dominated by faith in technical solutions, from electronic sensors to computer analysis to aerial surveillance, the speaking map demonstrated that human observational skills, grounded in deep cultural traditions, could perceive patterns that the most sophisticated technology missed. What Tallfeather showed us was that technology isn't necessarily superior to traditional knowledge. They perceive different aspects of reality, noted General David Mitchell, a former Special Operations Commander who studied the declassified materials as part of his work at the Army War College. Our technological systems were designed to detect specific signatures: heat, metal, electronic emissions, but they were blind to the subtle patterns of disturbance and relationship that Tallfeather could read. His traditional knowledge wasn't a primitive precursor to our technology. It was a sophisticated system operating on entirely different principles. This recognition has had significant implications for military thinking in subsequent decades. The declassification of Tallfeather's work coincided with a period of growing interest in what military theorists call human terrain, the cultural, social, and psychological dimensions of operational environments. His demonstration of how cultural knowledge could provide critical operational insights contributed to a broader reevaluation of the importance of these factors in military planning. More specifically, his work has influenced the development of specialized tracking and environmental intelligence programs within elite military units. While few details of these programs are publicly available due to their classified nature, military publications and training documents occasionally reference methodologies derived from the naturalist protocols. The formalized version of Tallfeather's approach developed in the early 1970s. Beyond military applications, the story of the speaking map has become increasingly significant within indigenous communities, particularly among veterans. As more details have emerged through declassification, Tallfeather's achievement has been recognized as a powerful validation of traditional knowledge in a context where its value would typically be dismissed or minimized. What Joe did wasn't just important for the military mission, explained Richard Two Bulls, a Lakota veteran who has worked to preserve Tallfeather's legacy. It was important for us, for our people. It showed that the knowledge our ancestors developed over thousands of years, knowledge that the government tried to stamp out through boarding schools and assimilation programs, was not only still valuable, but could succeed where the most advanced Western technology failed. That's a powerful statement about the continuing relevance of our traditions in the modern world. This perspective highlights an aspect of the story that military assessments often overlook: the cultural resilience it demonstrates. Despite generations of displacement, cultural suppression, and forced assimilation, Tallfeather was able to draw on knowledge that had been preserved through oral tradition and community practice. His achievement represents not just individual brilliance, but the success of indigenous communities in maintaining their knowledge systems against tremendous odds. In 2017, a significant step toward formal recognition came with the awarding of the Distinguished Service Cross to Tallfeather posthumously. The ceremony, held at Pine Ridge, was attended by tribal leaders, military officials, and numerous veterans. The citation acknowledged his extraordinary heroism and exceptional analytical contributions that fundamentally altered operational understanding and saved countless lives. While this recognition was welcomed by Tallfeather's family and community, many felt it still failed to capture the full significance of his contribution. The official narrative emphasized his individual achievements while minimizing the cultural context that made them possible: the generations of knowledge keepers who had preserved and transmit. Have you ever wondered what dark secrets lie buried in America's past, intentionally erased from our history books? What if I told you that one of the most brutal military campaigns in American history, a systematic war of extermination that rivals any colonial atrocity, has been deliberately sanitized in our national memory? Before I reveal the horrifying truth about what really happened during the Navajo War, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue exposing these hidden chapters of history that powerful institutions have worked for generations to conceal. The year was 1863. While the nation's attention was fixated on the blood-soaked battlefields of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, another war was raging in the American Southwest. This conflict would not be commemorated with marble monuments or romantic paintings. Instead, it would be methodically erased from the collective consciousness, a shameful chapter deemed too brutal for America's carefully curated national narrative. The Navajo War was unlike anything in American military history, explains Dr. Eleanor Whitehorse, professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of New Mexico and herself a descendant of Navajo survivors. What separates it from other Indian wars was not just its brutality, which was extreme, but the cold, systematic efficiency with which it was conducted. This wasn't a chaotic frontier conflict. It was a meticulously planned campaign of territorial cleansing. At the center of this dark chapter stood one man, Colonel James Henry Carleton, commander of the California Column and, after July 1862, military governor of the New Mexico Territory. Carleton's name rarely appears in standard American history textbooks, yet declassified military correspondence reveals him as the architect of one of the most ruthless campaigns of the 19th century. Carleton wasn't a frontier hothead or an undisciplined renegade, notes military historian Dr. Robert Blackwood. He was a West Point graduate, a professional soldier with significant combat experience. What makes his campaign against the Navajos so chilling is precisely how calculated it was. This wasn't frontier justice or spontaneous violence. It was policy. That policy was articulated with disturbing clarity in Carleton's own words. In a recently uncovered letter to his subordinate, Colonel Christopher Kit Carson, dated June 15, 1863, Carleton wrote, "The Navajo Indians have gone too far. All Navajo men are to be killed whenever and wherever you can find them. The women and children will be taken as prisoners. Say nothing of this, but do it." This explicit directive for gender-selective killing violated every established rule of warfare and would today be classified as a war crime. Yet it became the operational blueprint for what followed, a campaign so ruthless that even hardened frontier soldiers would later refuse to speak of what they had witnessed and participated in. The man tasked with executing this brutal policy was the celebrated frontiersman Kit Carson. Though remembered in popular culture as a romantic mountain man and Indian scout, declassified military records reveal a different Carson, the efficient executor of Carleton's merciless strategy. Kit Carson's reputation has been carefully sanitized over the decades, explains historian Dr. Thomas Jenkins. The myth-making began even during his lifetime. The dime novels portrayed him as a heroic scout and Indian fighter, but conveniently omitted his role in what amounted to a campaign of extermination against the Navajo. His participation in these atrocities has been deliberately erased from our national memory. First, Carson's scorched earth campaign against the Dene, as the Navajo call themselves, began in earnest in July 1863. His strategy was not to engage Navajo warriors in conventional battle, but to systematically destroy their ability to survive in their homeland. Carson's troops burned crops, poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock, and demolished homes, creating what military strategists would later call a total war against environment. Sarah Yellowhair, a Navajo elder whose family oral history preserved accounts of the war, described the approach. Our ancestors told of how the soldiers didn't just come to fight warriors. They came to fight the land itself, to make it impossible for us to live there. They destroyed peach orchards that had taken generations to cultivate. They burned fields of corn just as they were ripening. They poisoned the sacred springs that had sustained our people for centuries. The environmental devastation was meticulously documented in military reports that remained classified until the 1970s. Captain Asa Carey of the 1st New Mexico Volunteers recorded in his field journal, "In the last 2 weeks, we have destroyed over 4,000 peach trees, burned 200 acres of corn, and slaughtered more than 5,000 sheep and goats. The valley that once sustained hundreds of families is now unrecognizable." This environmental warfare was just the beginning. As winter approached in 1863, Navajo families faced an impossible choice: surrender to an enemy who had explicitly ordered the killing of all adult males, or try to survive a harsh winter in the mountains with their food sources destroyed. Mary Begay, whose great-grandmother survived the war as a young girl, shared a family account that had been passed down through generations. "My ancestor told of hiding in a high canyon as the soldiers burned their home below. They lived on pine nuts and what little they could forage. Many in their group died of exposure that winter. The children's feet froze in the snow. They wrapped them in rabbit skins, but gangrene set in. They had to choose which children might survive the journey to surrender." As starvation and exposure took their toll, Navajo families began to surrender. But the horror didn't end with capitulation. What awaited them was a forced march that would later be known as the Long Walk, a 300-mile journey from their homeland to Bosque Redondo, a desolate internment camp at Fort Sumner in eastern New Mexico. Recently discovered military dispatches reveal that this march was not merely a difficult journey, but a deliberate continuation of the elimination strategy. Captain George Pettis of the California Column wrote in a suppressed report, "Those who lag behind are left where they fall. Yesterday, I observed at least 14 bodies along the trail, mostly women and small children. When I inquired about medical attention for those struggling to keep pace, I was informed that our orders permit no delay." The Long Walk wasn't one march, but a series of forced relocations between 1863 and 1866. Military records indicate that approximately 10,000 Navajo were eventually interned at Bosque Redondo. What these sterile figures fail to capture is the human suffering involved in these death marches. Jacob Thompson, a military surgeon assigned to one of the later marches, wrote in his private diary, "I am haunted by what I witnessed today." A Navajo woman gave birth on the trail. She was forced to continue walking immediately after delivery, carrying her newborn. 3 hours later, she collapsed from blood loss. The guard ordered her to rise. When she could not, he shot her and the infant where they lay. I lodged a formal complaint, but was informed that the guard had acted within his orders to prevent delay. I no longer recognize the army in which I serve. Thompson's diary remained in his family's private possession until 2007, when his great-granddaughter donated it to the University of New Mexico archives. Its contents contradicted the official military reports, which claimed that the relocations were conducted with all possible humanity. If the long walk was a death march, what awaited the survivors at Bosque Redondo was a death camp in all but name. Situated on an alkali plain with inadequate water, poor soil, and insufficient firewood, the reservation was fundamentally unsuitable for human habitation, much less agriculture. Military correspondence uncovered in the National Archives reveals that this unsuitability was not accidental, but intentional. In a letter to his superiors in Washington, Carleton wrote, "The land at Bosque Redondo will not support the Navajo population without significant external supply, which I have no intention of providing beyond the minimum necessary to prevent immediate starvation. Over time, natural attrition will reduce their numbers to a more manageable level." This natural attrition came in the form of starvation, disease, and exposure. Army records show that official rations at Bosque Redondo provided less than 800 calories per person per day, less than half what was needed for survival, especially given the hard labor demanded of internees. Dysentery, measles, and pneumonia swept through the camp. Without adequate medical care, the death toll was catastrophic. Conservative military estimates acknowledged that at least 1 in 4 Navajo died during the 4 years of internment. Navajo oral histories and some military whistleblowers suggested the true figure was closer to 1 in 3. William Sherman, a quartermaster's clerk at Fort Sumner, wrote in a suppressed report, "I have been instructed to record deaths as resulting from natural causes, regardless of the actual circumstances. Starvation is never to be listed as a cause of death, though it is plainly the primary factor in most cases. We are bearing witness to a carefully managed elimination that dare not speak its name." Chitin, perhaps most disturbing, were the experiments conducted at Bosque Redondo under the guise of civilization programs. Recently declassified Interior Department records reveal that Navajo internees were subjected to nutritional experiments, testing how long humans could survive on reduced rations and unfamiliar foods. Dr. Michael Williams, a contract physician at the camp, documented these experiments in reports that were immediately classified upon receipt in Washington. "The subjects exhibit progressive symptoms of malnutrition," he wrote in August 1864. "Hair loss, bleeding gums, cognitive impairment, and eventually organ failure." Despite my repeated warnings about the ethical implications of these trials, I am instructed to continue observations and record results. Even children were not spared from this clinical cruelty. A government education inspector, Robert Benedict, reported that Navajo children at the camp school were deliberately separated into different nutritional groups to determine optimal minimum requirements for Indian education programs. Children in the lowest ration group received only cornmeal and occasional salt pork, leading to night blindness, skin lesions, and developmental delays. What happened at Bosque Redondo meets the modern definition of genocide, asserts Dr. Whitehorse. It wasn't just cultural destruction, though. That certainly occurred. It was a deliberate attempt to physically eliminate a people through starvation, disease, exposure, and what we would now call lethal human experimentation. By 1866, even the military recognized that the Bosque Redondo experiment was a humanitarian catastrophe that threatened to become a public relations disaster as reports began to leak to Eastern newspapers. General William Tecumseh Sherman, fresh from his march to the sea during the Civil War, was dispatched to inspect the reservation. Sherman's personal papers, only recently made available to researchers, reveal his shock at what he encountered. "I have witnessed the aftermath of battlefields and the burning of Atlanta," he wrote to his wife. "But nothing prepared me for the systematic misery I observed at this reservation. The Navajo, once a proud and self-sufficient people, have been reduced to skeletons subsisting on rations that would be rejected by our prisoners of war. This is not warfare as I understand it, but something altogether more sinister." 2. Sherman's intervention led to negotiations for a treaty that would eventually allow the Navajo to return to a portion of their homeland in 1868. But the treaty itself, while ending the immediate suffering at Bosque Redondo, codified the theft of more than half of the traditional Navajo territory and imposed restrictive conditions that would hamper their recovery for generations. The devastation of the Navajo War and the Bosque Redondo internment cannot be overstated. When the survivors finally returned to their homeland in 1868, they numbered fewer than 8,000, a reduction of approximately 40% from their pre-war population. They returned to a landscape transformed by Carson's scorched earth campaign, with ancient orchards destroyed, irrigation systems dismantled, and entire villages reduced to ash. Our people call this period Hueldi, the time of extreme hardship, explains Navajo historian Dr. James Tsosi. But that translation doesn't capture the full meaning. It refers not just to suffering, but to a deliberate attempt to erase us from existence. What happened wasn't just war or conquest. It was an orchestrated campaign to eliminate the Diné as a people. This campaign extended beyond physical elimination to include the destruction of historical and cultural memory. Army units systematically destroyed sacred sites, ceremonial objects, and petroglyph panels that recorded Navajo history. Captain Amos Johnson of the 1st California Volunteers noted in his field journal, "Today, we demolished what the men described as an Indian temple of some kind. Several stone tablets with markings were smashed, and ceremonial items burned. Colonel's orders are to eliminate any traces of their presence in this territory." This cultural destruction continued at Bosque Redondo, where traditional religious practices were prohibited under penalty of starvation. Children were punished for speaking their language, and medicine men were specifically targeted for harsh treatment. Military records indicate that at least 17 Navajo spiritual leaders died under mysterious circumstances during internment. What makes the Navajo War unique in American history is not just its brutality, which was extreme, but the coordinated attempt to eliminate all evidence that it occurred, explains historian Dr. Rebecca Larson. After 1870, we see a systematic effort to sanitize official records, destroy incriminating documents, and create a more palatable narrative about a necessary relocation rather than an attempted extermination. This historical sanitization was remarkably effective. For over a century, the full extent of what happened to the Navajo remained largely unknown outside the Diné themselves, who preserved the truth through oral tradition when written history failed them. Standard American history textbooks either omitted the conflict entirely or presented a heavily whitewashed version focusing on the supposed benefits of the civilization program. It wasn't until the 1970s, when the Freedom of Information Act allowed researchers to access previously classified military records, that documented evidence began to emerge confirming what Navajo oral historians had maintained for generations. Even today, new documents continue to surface, revealing ever more disturbing details of a campaign that one military whistleblower described as a stain upon our flag that no amount of laundering will ever remove. As these records have become available, they've revealed not just the brutality of what occurred, but the extent of the subsequent cover-up. In 1872, the War Department issued a directive to review and sanitize all records pertaining to the Navajo campaign and the Bosque Redondo Reservation. Documents deemed potentially injurious to the reputation of the department or the nation were to be secured in confidential archives or permanently destroyed. An internal memo discovered in the National Archives in 1998 revealed the reasoning behind this historical erasure. The methods employed, while effective in achieving territorial objectives, do not reflect the character of a civilized nation and would provide ammunition to those who question our moral authority in dealing with the Indian problem. These records are to be restricted in perpetuity. This institutional amnesia served a larger purpose beyond protecting military reputations. It allowed for the construction of a national narrative that portrayed Western expansion as an inevitable and largely peaceful process, with occasional regrettable but necessary conflicts with hostile tribes. The reality of deliberate extermination campaigns targeting specific peoples for elimination could not be reconciled with America's self-image as a beacon of democracy and human rights. What happened to the Navajo wasn't an aberration or the actions of rogue commanders, insists Dr. Whitehorse. It was the logical conclusion of a policy articulated at the highest levels of government, the elimination of native peoples who stood in the way of territorial expansion and resource extraction. The only thing unusual about the Navajo War was the extensive paper trail it left behind, which proved too large to completely destroy. That paper trail continues to grow as more documents emerge from private collections, family archives, and declassified government repositories. Each new discovery adds detail to a history that challenges fundamental assumptions about American expansion and forces a reconsideration of how we understand our national past. The Navajo War represents a historical reckoning we have yet to fully confront, argues Dr. Jenkins. It's not just about acknowledging a single atrocity, however massive. It's about recognizing that our national origin story has been sanitized to exclude the deliberate elimination of peoples who stood in the way of what we euphemistically call progress. For the Navajo Nation, now the largest indigenous tribal nation in the United States, with over 300,000 enrolled members, the recovery of this hidden history represents both a painful reopening of generational trauma and a validation of what their communities have always known and preserved. My grandmother's grandmother walked the long walk as a child, shares Marie Benally, a Navajo language teacher in Window Rock. The stories she passed down through our family didn't appear in any history book I ever read in school. For generations, we were told either that these atrocities never happened or that our ancestors were exaggerating. The documents emerging now confirm what our elders always knew, that what happened was not just war, but something far darker. The systematic erasure of the Navajo War's true nature from official history created a distorted understanding that persists to this day. While the bare facts of the Long Walk might appear in some textbooks, the deliberate genocidal intent behind the campaign remains largely unacknowledged in mainstream American consciousness. This historical amnesia served specific purposes that extended far beyond protecting the reputations of military leaders like Carleton and Carson. The sanitization of the Navajo War was about more than just covering up atrocities, explains Dr. Samuel Blackwood, historian at the Center for Advanced Studies in American History. It was about creating a usable past that justified continued westward expansion and the dispossession of other indigenous nations. If Americans believed that previous removals had been regrettable, but essentially humane responses to military necessity, they would support similar actions against other tribes who stood in the path of mining interests, railroad construction, and white settlement. This manufactured narrative proved remarkably effective. Throughout the 1870s and 80s, as campaigns against the Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, and other nations intensified, newspaper editorials frequently cited the successful and humane relocation of the Navajo as evidence that such policies benefited both settlers and indigenous peoples. The actual fate of the thousands who died during the Navajo campaign remained conveniently unmentioned. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this historical erasure was its institutional nature. Recent investigations of education records from the early 20th century reveal that government officials actively intervened to ensure that school textbooks presented a sanitized version of Western expansion. A 1911 memo from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to major textbook publishers explicitly discouraged excessive detail regarding the methods employed in the pacification of hostile tribes, suggesting instead a focus on the ultimate benefits of civilization brought to primitive peoples. This directive was overwhelmingly successful. A comprehensive review of American history textbooks published between 1900 and 1970 found that 92% either omitted the Navajo War entirely or described it in terms of a necessary relocation, without mentioning the deliberate starvation, mass killings, or death marches that characterized the campaign. For the survivors of the Navajo War and their descendants, this historical erasure constituted a second trauma, the denial of their lived experience and suffering. With their written records destroyed and their oral histories dismissed as unreliable by mainstream historians, the Diné were forced to preserve the truth through carefully maintained family narratives passed down through generations. My great-grandfather was one of the survivors of Fort Sumner, shares Thomas Begay, a Navajo elder who has dedicated his life to preserving these stories. He was just a boy when they were marched to Hueldi. His parents and 3 siblings died there. When he returned to our homeland, he made his children and grandchildren memorize the names of everyone in our family who died during that time, and exactly how they died. He said, "The Americans will try to make you forget what they did to us. Never forget." This determination to preserve the truth extended beyond individual families to become a central element of Navajo cultural resistance. Traditional songs, ceremonies, and weavings incorporated coded references to specific atrocities, creating an alternative historical record that could survive even when direct testimony was suppressed or dismissed. Our grandmothers wove the truth into their blankets when they couldn't speak it aloud, explains Dr. Sarah Yellowhorse, curator at the Navajo Nation Museum. Certain patterns and color combinations record specific events from the war and internment period. A trained eye can read these textiles like historical documents. This pattern shows soldiers burning a village. This one represents children dying of starvation at Bosque Redondo. When written history failed us, we preserved the truth in wool and dye. This cultural preservation of historical memory proved crucial when, decades later, researchers began seeking evidence of what had actually occurred. Navajo oral historians could direct investigators to specific massacre sites, identify the locations of mass graves, and provide details that helped contextualize the fragmentary written records that had survived the official purges. One such site, known in Navajo as Tseyi Biu Hiuchini, Rock Where Children Cried, was long described in oral histories as a place where soldiers had cornered and massacred a group of predominantly women and children hiding in a canyon. For over a century, mainstream historians dismissed this account as folklore or exaggeration. In 1998, archaeological investigations guided by Navajo elders uncovered the remains of at least 78 individuals, primarily women and children, with evidence of execution-style killings consistent with the oral accounts. That excavation was a turning point, notes Dr. Jenkins. It provided physical confirmation of events that had been preserved in Navajo oral tradition but dismissed by conventional historical methods. It forced a reevaluation of how we weigh different types of historical evidence and raised uncomfortable questions about what other legends might actually be accurate accounts of atrocities. Similar investigations have since uncovered multiple mass burial sites, both along the route of the Long Walk and at Bosque Redondo itself. Forensic analysis of these remains has revealed patterns of malnutrition, disease, and violence that corroborate the accounts preserved in Navajo oral history and the suppressed military documents that have gradually come to light. The emerging physical evidence has made it increasingly difficult to maintain the sanitized version of the Navajo War that dominated American historiography for over a century. Yet institutional resistance to fully acknowledging the genocide attempted against the Diné remains powerful. As recently as 2011, when the New Mexico state legislature considered a resolution formally recognizing the genocidal nature of the campaign against the Navajo, they faced intense opposition from historical societies, veterans groups, and descendants of territorial settlers. There's an enormous investment in maintaining the traditional narrative of Western expansion, explains Dr. Whitehorse. Acknowledging that what happened to the Navajo was a deliberate attempt at elimination rather than an unfortunate tragedy undermines foundational myths about American exceptionalism and moral authority. It raises uncomfortable questions about how we understand everything from property rights to national identity. These questions become particularly acute when examining the economic motivations behind the Navajo War, another aspect of the conflict that was systematically erased from official histories. While military reports emphasized supposed Navajo raids on settlements, recently discovered correspondence between Carleton and various mining interests reveals a far more calculating purpose behind the campaign. A letter from Carleton to James Hubble, a prominent mining investor, dated March 1863, just months before the launch of the campaign, explicitly connects the planned removal of the Navajo to mineral extraction. Once the territory is cleared of its current occupants, the entire region will be opened for proper exploration and development. Preliminary surveys indicate substantial deposits that cannot be accessed while the tribes retain control of the land. 2. Similar correspondence with railroad interests suggests that the planned route of the Transcontinental Railroad through northern New Mexico and Arizona was a major factor in the decision to remove the Navajo population. An 1862 report from a railroad survey team complained that the presence of large numbers of hostile Indians makes proper surveying impossible and would present an insurmountable obstacle to construction. When you examine the timing and location of the most intense military operations against the Navajo, they correlate directly with areas of economic interest to American business concerns, notes economic historian Dr. Jonathan Reynolds. The parts of Navajo territory that were most aggressively cleared were precisely those with known mineral deposits or along planned transportation corridors. This wasn't coincidental. It was strategic. This economic calculation extended to the selection of Bosque Redondo as an internment site. While military correspondence presented the location as chosen for security and agricultural potential, internal documents reveal that it was selected partly because it was economically worthless land that would never be desired by white settlers or business interests. Captain William Davis, who surveyed the Bosque Redondo site before the Navajo relocation, wrote in a suppressed report, "This land is unsuitable for sustained human habitation. The water is alkaline and insufficient for the population projected to be interned here. The soil will not support significant agriculture without extensive irrigation that would require resources far beyond what has been allocated. I can only conclude that this site was selected precisely because of these deficiencies, with the expectation that the population will not thrive." This convergence of military strategy, economic interests, and territorial acquisition reveals a calculated attempt at what would now be termed ethnic cleansing, the forced removal of a population to clear valuable territory for exploitation. Yet, this aspect of the Navajo War was systematically obscured in favor of narratives about frontier defense and the Indian problem. The economic beneficiaries of the Navajo removal wasted no time in exploiting the newly available territory. Within months of the forced marches to Bosque Redondo, mining claims were being staked throughout traditional Navajo lands. By 1865, while thousands of Navajo were still dying in internment, at least 27 new mining operations had been established in areas that had been cleared of their indigenous inhabitants. Railroad surveys quickly followed, plotting routes through lands that had been occupied by Navajo families for generations. Land grants to politically connected settlers transferred thousands of acres of prime agricultural land and water sources to territorial elites. This rapid exploitation gives the lie to claims that the removal was a reluctant military necessity rather than a calculated economic strategy. The speed with which economic development followed military operations suggests premeditation, argues Dr. Reynolds. This wasn't opportunistic exploitation of newly available land. It was the execution of a predetermined plan to transfer resources from indigenous control to American business interests. The military campaign was simply the mechanism for accomplishing this transfer. Then, the connections between the architects of the Navajo campaign and these economic beneficiaries were often direct and personal. Colonel Carleton himself acquired mining interests in former Navajo territory after leaving military service. Several of his subordinate officers received land grants in areas they had helped to clear. Kit Carson, though less directly involved in post-war exploitation, accepted substantial gifts from mining and railroad interests celebrating his opening of the territory. These economic motivations and connections were systematically erased from official histories of the period. School textbooks presented the conflict as a necessary security measure rather than an economic land grab. Military histories emphasized tactical considerations while ignoring the financial interests that shaped strategic decisions. Even academic treatments largely failed to connect the dots between mineral surveys, railroad plans, and military campaigns. This economic context helps explain both the extreme brutality of the campaign and the extensive effort to conceal that brutality afterward. The complete elimination of the Navajo people from their resource-rich homeland required methods that went beyond conventional warfare. Yet acknowledging these methods would have revealed the campaign's true purpose and undermined the moral justifications offered for westward expansion more broadly. There was a direct relationship between economic value and violence, notes Dr. Tsosi. The areas where our people faced the most brutal clearing operations were precisely those with the richest resources or the greatest strategic value for transportation. This wasn't frontier chaos. It was calculating elimination for profit. The aftermath of the Navajo War reveals further evidence of its true nature. When the survivors were finally allowed to return to their homeland in 1868, they found that their territory had been reduced by more than half. The areas they were permitted to occupy were primarily the most marginal lands, arid, resource-poor regions that American economic interests had deemed worthless. The resource-rich areas, those with the best water sources, mineral deposits, and potential for railroad access, remained under American control. This territorial redistribution was not random, but carefully calculated to ensure that the economic benefits of the region flowed to American interests rather than to the indigenous people who had developed the land for centuries. Even the treaty that permitted the Navajo to return from Bosque Redondo contained provisions designed to prevent their economic recovery and independence. Restrictions on movement, limitations on livestock holdings, and requirements for children to attend government schools where traditional knowledge was suppressed all worked to maintain Navajo dependency and prevent them from challenging the new economic order. The treaty wasn't a peace agreement between equals, explains Dr. Whitehorse. It was the formalization of conquest, designed to ensure that the Navajo would never again have the economic or territorial base to resist American expansion. Even the concession, allowing them to return to a portion of their homeland, was calculated. The internment at Bosque Redondo had proven too expensive to maintain, and allowing a controlled return to marginal lands was deemed more cost-effective. This calculated impoverishment would have long-lasting consequences. By the early 20th century, the Navajo Reservation had some of the highest poverty rates in the United States. Limited access to water, restrictions on traditional livelihoods, and systematic underdevelopment created conditions of extreme hardship that persisted for generations. Meanwhile, the wealth extracted from their former territories flowed to distant cities and investors. Gold, silver, copper, and later uranium were mined from lands once belonging to the Diné, creating fortunes for companies based in New York, Boston, and San Francisco. Railroads crossed their former territory, connecting the coasts while bypassing Navajo communities. Even the tourism industry developed around the natural beauty of the region benefited outside interests rather than the indigenous people who had stewarded the land for centuries. The economic devastation inflicted on the Navajo was as much a part of the genocide as the killings and starvation, argues economic historian Dr. Elizabeth Blackhorse. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy their capacity for independent existence, to eliminate not just individual lives, but the collective ability to maintain their way of life and relationship with the land. This economic dimension of the genocide attempted against the Navajo has received far less attention than the physical atrocities. Yet in many ways, its effects have been more enduring. While the Navajo population eventually recovered and grew beyond its pre-war numbers, the economic displacement and resource theft created structural inequalities that continue to shape life in the Navajo Nation today. When we talk about historical trauma, we're not just referring to the emotional legacy of violence, explains Dr. Tisozi. We're talking about concrete material conditions, lack of access to water, limited economic opportunities, inadequate infrastructure, that are direct consequences of how the Navajo War was conducted and how its aftermath was managed. These aren't just historical grievances. They're present realities that shape every aspect of contemporary Navajo life. This continuity between historical atrocity and present conditions makes the systematic erasure of the Navajo War's true nature particularly harmful. Without a clear understanding of how current inequalities were deliberately created through historical policies, it becomes too easy to naturalize these disparities or attribute them to cultural differences rather than recognizing them as the ongoing effects of calculated dispossession. The myth that what happened was merely an unfortunate relocation rather than a genocidal campaign serves to obscure the connections between past policies and present conditions, notes Dr. Whitehorse. It allows Americans to compartmentalize this history as a regrettable but closed chapter, rather than acknowledging it as an ongoing process whose effects continue to structure reality in the American Southwest. Recent decades have seen increasing efforts to recover and acknowledge the full truth of what happened to the Navajo during this period. The establishment of the Bosque Redondo Memorial in 2005 created a space for public education about the internment and forced marches. Navajo-led historical preservation projects have worked to document massacre sites and gather remaining oral histories from elders whose families preserved accounts of the war. Educational initiatives within the Navajo Nation have developed curriculum materials that incorporate both documentary evidence and traditional knowledge to present a more complete picture of this historical trauma to younger generations. Some state education systems, particularly in New Mexico and Arizona, have begun to include more accurate treatments of the Navajo War in their social studies standards, though these efforts remain uneven and often face resistance. At the federal level, acknowledgement has been more limited, while various officials have expressed regret for historical wrongs against Native peoples in general terms. There has never been a specific formal apology for the attempted genocide against the Navajo. Military histories still tend to present the campaign in terms that emphasize tactical considerations, while downplaying or ignoring the deliberate targeting of civilians and the systematic destruction of the Navajo economic base. This incomplete reckoning reflects broader patterns in how America confronts difficult aspects of its past. Unlike some nations that have established truth and reconciliation commissions or similar mechanisms to address historical atrocities, The United States has generally preferred apologies without substantive acknowledgement of specific crimes, symbolic gestures without material reparations, and gradual curricular reform, rather than comprehensive public education about historical wrongs. For many Navajo people, this limited acknowledgement feels both insufficient and deeply personal. "This isn't ancient history for us," explains Marie Benally. "My grandmother told me stories she heard directly from relatives who survived the long walk. When I hear politicians or commentators dismiss this history or suggest we should move on, I wonder if they would say the same if it were their grandparents who had endured these horrors." Despite these challenges, there are signs of changing awareness. Social media and digital archives have made previously obscure historical documents more accessible to the general public. Indigenous historians and knowledge keepers have gained platforms to share perspectives that were once excluded from academic discourse. Young activists, both native and non-native, have shown increasing interest in confronting historical injustices as part of broader movements for social change. We're seeing a generational shift in willingness to engage with difficult truths about our national past, observes Dr. Jenkins. Younger Americans seem less invested in maintaining comforting myths and more interested in understanding how historical injustices shape contemporary realities. This creates space for a more honest reckoning with events like the Navajo War. This reckoning matters not just for historical accuracy, but for present justice. The ongoing effects of the Navajo War, from disputed land claims to water rights to economic development challenges, cannot be adequately addressed without a clear understanding of their historical origins. Policy solutions that ignore this.
At 4:47 on the morning of May 11, 1945, Private John McKinney lay in his tent near Dingalan Bay, Luzon, unaware that approximately 100 Japanese soldiers were creeping through the jungle toward his position. 24 years old, 2.5 years in the Army, a sharecropper's son from Georgia with a third-grade education. By May 1945, the Philippine campaign had already cost the United States over 60,000 casualties. Japanese forces on Luzon refused to surrender. They launched night attacks, dawn raids, suicide charges against American perimeters. Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment, 33rd Infantry Division, had established an outpost near Dingalan Bay in Tayabas Province. The position guarded a crucial supply route. 3 Americans manned a light machine gun on the perimeter. McKinney had just finished a long shift at that gun. He walked a few paces to his tent, laid down with his M1 rifle beside him. The jungle was quiet. The Japanese knew this outpost existed. They had been watching it for days, counting the Americans, timing the guard rotations, planning their assault. The attack force moved through the darkness. Over 100 soldiers from remnants of Japanese units still fighting on Luzon. They carried rifles, grenades, knee mortars, and swords. Their objective was simple: overrun the American position, kill everyone, capture the supplies. The vanguard slipped past the outer guard post undetected. Sergeant Fukutaro Morii led the advance element. His orders were to eliminate the first Americans silently. No gunfire, swords and bayonets only. By the time the main force attacked, the perimeter would already be compromised. Morii reached McKinney's tent. He could hear the American breathing inside. One quick strike would end this man's life before he could raise an alarm. McKinney had grown up hunting in the Georgia woods. His father was a sharecropper in Screven County. The family had nothing. John learned to shoot before he learned to read. By the time he was 12, he could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with a .22 rifle. He trapped rabbits, shot deer. Fishing and hunting put food on the family table when the crops failed. He enlisted at Fort McPherson in November 1942. The Army discovered he could barely read or write. They also discovered he was one of the best marksmen they had ever seen. His qualification scores were exceptional. Drill sergeants noticed he moved through the woods differently than other soldiers. Quieter, more aware. He had spent his entire life in environments where a single mistake meant going hungry. The 33rd Infantry Division shipped to the Pacific in 1943. McKinney fought through New Guinea, survived the jungle, survived the Japanese, survived malaria and dysentery and everything else the Pacific Theater threw at American soldiers. By May 1945, he was a veteran. Quiet, kept to himself, did his duty, never complained. His fellow soldiers knew two things about John McKinney. He was the best shot in the company, and he slept with his rifle. That rifle was about to save his life. If you want to see how McKinney survived what happened next, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to McKinney. Sergeant Maury threw open the tent flap at 4:51. The sword came down in a diagonal slash aimed at McKinney's neck. In the darkness, Maury misjudged the distance. The blade caught McKinney on the side of the head instead. It severed part of his right ear. Blood sprayed across the tent canvas. McKinney's eyes opened to searing pain and the silhouette of a man standing over him with a raised sword. He had less than 1 second to react. Maury was already bringing the blade down for a second strike. This one would not miss. McKinney's hand found his rifle in the darkness. He did not aim. He did not think. 24 years of survival instinct took over. He swung the M1 like a club. The rifle butt caught Maury under the chin with enough force to shatter bone. The Japanese sergeant staggered. McKinney swung again. The second blow crushed Maury's skull. Outside the tent, McKinney could hear them. Footsteps. Dozens of footsteps. Moving fast through the camp. The main assault had begun. He was bleeding badly from his ear. His head was ringing from the sword strike. And somewhere in the darkness, nearly 100 Japanese soldiers were coming to kill everyone he knew. McKinney grabbed his rifle and stepped out of the tent. What he saw made his blood run cold. The machine gun position was 30 yards from his tent. 3 Americans had been manning it when he went to rest. Now he could see muzzle flashes in the darkness. Screaming. The distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles mixing with the heavier reports of M1 Garands. Japanese soldiers were pouring through the perimeter from the northeast. They moved in waves. The first wave had already reached the machine gun emplacement. McKinney could see figures struggling in the darkness around the gun pit. His mind processed the tactical situation in seconds. The machine gun was the key to the entire position. It covered the main approach to the American camp. If the Japanese captured it and turned it around, they could rake the entire perimeter with fire. Every American in Company A would die. McKinney ran toward the gun. The 2 soldiers who had replaced him at the machine gun were fighting for their lives. Private James Hendricks had taken a bayonet wound to the shoulder in the first seconds of the attack. The third man, seeing Hendricks go down, made a decision. He grabbed his wounded comrade and dragged him toward the rear of the perimeter. It was the right call. Hendricks would have bled out if left behind, but it meant the machine gun was now undefended. 10 Japanese infantrymen reached the emplacement before McKinney could get there. They swarmed over the sandbag wall. One of them immediately began trying to turn the gun around. The others provided security, rifles pointed outward, watching for any American counterattack. McKinney did not slow down. He did not take cover. He did not wait for backup. He sprinted directly at 10 enemy soldiers who had just captured the most important weapon in the entire outpost. The Japanese saw him coming. A single American, bleeding from a head wound, charging straight at them in the pre-dawn darkness. 2 of them raised their rifles. McKinney was faster. He shot the first man at 15 yards. The M1's report echoed across the camp. He shot the second man at 10 yards. By the time he reached the sandbag wall, he had fired 4 rounds. 4 Japanese soldiers were down. He leaped into the emplacement. The space inside was roughly 8 feet by 6 feet. 6 enemy soldiers were still alive in that confined area. Some were trying to swing their rifles around. Others reached for bayonets. One was still fumbling with the machine gun's traversing mechanism. McKinney landed among them and kept firing. Point-blank range. The M1 Garand held 8 rounds in its internal magazine. He had already fired 4. He put the next 3 rounds into 3 more Japanese soldiers at distances measured in inches rather than yards. 1 round left. The 8th man was directly in front of him, bayonet raised for a thrust at McKinney's chest. McKinney fired his last round. The soldier dropped. The M1 Garand's bolt locked back on an empty magazine with its distinctive metallic ping. 3 Japanese soldiers were still alive in the gun pit. They had heard that sound. They knew what it meant. McKinney reversed his grip on the rifle before the empty clip had finished ejecting. He swung the weapon like an axe. The walnut stock connected with the first soldier's temple. The man collapsed. McKinney swung again. The second soldier tried to block with his forearm. The rifle butt shattered bone and continued into his skull. The third soldier lunged with a bayonet. McKinney sidestepped and brought the rifle down on the back of the man's neck. The vertebrae cracked audibly. 10 Japanese soldiers had captured the machine gun. 30 seconds later, all 10 were dead. McKinney grabbed for the machine gun. His hands found the receiver. Something was wrong. During the struggle, the weapon had been damaged. The bolt was jammed. The feed tray was bent. He cycled the charging handle twice. Nothing. The gun would not fire. The most important weapon in the perimeter was now useless. McKinney looked up from the broken machine gun. Dawn was starting to lighten the eastern horizon, and in that gray light, he could see them. More Japanese soldiers. Many more. They were regrouping at the edge of the jungle, preparing for the next wave. He had an M1 rifle with an empty magazine. He had just killed 10 men in hand-to-hand combat. His ear was still bleeding, and the main assault had not even started yet. McKinney reached down and pulled a bandolier of ammunition from one of the dead Japanese soldiers. American .30 caliber rounds. The man had probably taken them from a previous engagement. McKinney loaded a fresh clip into his rifle. Somewhere in the darkness, a Japanese officer was shouting orders. McKinney could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were coming again. He settled into the gun pit among the bodies of the men he had just killed, rested his rifle on the sandbag wall, and waited. The second wave emerged from the jungle 60 yards away. McKinney counted at least 20 soldiers in the first line, more behind them. They came at a run, rifles with fixed bayonets extended, screaming as they charged. McKinney put his front sight on the lead soldier and squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand was designed for rapid semi-automatic fire. A trained soldier could put 8 aimed rounds downrange in under 10 seconds. McKinney was not a trained soldier. He was a hunter from Georgia who had been shooting since childhood. He was faster. The first Japanese soldier dropped at 60 yards. McKinney shifted his aim. The second man fell, then the third. The M1 kicked against his shoulder with each shot. Brass casings ejected to his right. He did not think about what he was doing. His body remembered thousands of hours in the Georgia woods. Lead the target, squeeze the trigger, acquire the next target, repeat. The clip ejected with a ping. McKinney slammed in a fresh one from the bandolier. The charging wave had covered 20 yards during his reload, 40 yards now. He started firing again. The Japanese soldiers in the second wave had expected to find a captured machine gun position. They had expected their comrades to be turning that gun on the sleeping Americans. Instead, they found one man with a rifle cutting them down with mechanical precision. 8 rounds, reload. 8 rounds, reload. Some of the attackers made it to within 15 yards of the gun pit before McKinney dropped them. Others tried to veer left or right, seeking cover. He tracked them and fired. A soldier who moved was easier to hit than a soldier who stood still. McKinney had learned that hunting deer. The second wave broke. The survivors scattered back toward the jungle. McKinney counted the bodies in front of his position. 11 more, 21 total since the attack began. He did not have time to feel relief. Japanese officers were already reorganizing. He could hear them shouting beyond the tree line. And now he heard something else. A hollow thump from somewhere in the jungle. Then another. Knee mortars. The first round exploded 10 yards to his left. Dirt and shrapnel sprayed across the gun pit. McKinney flattened himself against the sandbags. The second round hit closer. The third landed directly on the parapet, showering him with debris. The Japanese had learned from the first 2 waves. They were not going to charge blindly into his rifle fire again. They would soften the position with mortars first, kill him or force him to keep his head down, then send in the infantry. McKinney understood the tactical problem immediately. If he stayed in the gun pit, The mortars would eventually find him. The Japanese gunners were adjusting their aim with each shot, getting closer. But if he moved, he would lose the only fortified position in this section of the perimeter. A grenade landed 3 feet away from him. McKinney grabbed it and threw it back over the sandbags. It exploded in midair. The blast wave knocked him sideways. His ears were ringing now. Blood from his severed ear had soaked through the makeshift bandage he had pressed against the wound. Another mortar round hit the sandbags directly. The wall partially collapsed. McKinney was now half exposed to the jungle. He made his decision. Staying meant death. He grabbed 2 bandoliers of ammunition from the dead soldiers around him, slung them over his shoulder, and ran. The Japanese saw him moving. Rifle fire cracked from the tree line. Bullets snapped past his head. McKinney sprinted 15 yards to a shallow depression in the ground. Not a proper foxhole, just a slight dip in the terrain. He threw himself into it and rolled onto his back. Rounds kicked up dirt inches from his face. He crawled to the edge of the depression, found a firing position. The Japanese infantry was moving again. They thought he was running. They thought he was retreating. 2 squads emerged from the jungle at a fast walk, rifles ready, moving toward the abandoned gun pit. McKinney let them get to 30 yards. Then he opened fire. The attackers had bunched together while crossing the open ground. A mistake. McKinney's first shot dropped the point man. His second hit the soldier directly behind. The group scattered, but there was no cover between the jungle and McKinney's new position. He picked them off as they ran. 8 rounds. Reload. The survivors reached the gun pit and found only bodies, their comrades from the first wave. They had expected to find the American there. Instead, they found him shooting at them from a completely different angle. 3 more fell before they could locate his muzzle flash. McKinney changed position again. He moved 10 yards to his right while the Japanese tried to reorganize. Found another depression. Started firing from the new location. He was doing what he had done in the Georgia woods. Never stay in one place. Never let your target predict where the next shot will come from. A deer that hears 1 gunshot will freeze. A deer that hears 2 from different locations will run in circles. The Japanese were running in circles. Dawn light was spreading across the sky. McKinney had been fighting for 18 minutes. His ammunition was running low. His ear was still bleeding, and he could see movement in the jungle that suggested the enemy was massing for another major push. He needed more ammunition, and he knew exactly where to find it. The dead Japanese soldiers around the gun pit carried ammunition. Not just the .30 caliber rounds he had already scavenged. Some of them had Arisaka rifles with full pouches. Others had grenades clipped to their belts. McKinney needed to get back there. He waited for a lull in the mortar fire, counted to 3, then sprinted across the open ground toward the gun pit. Rifle fire erupted from the tree line. McKinney ran in a zigzag pattern. A bullet tugged at his sleeve. Another cracked past his ear. He dove the last 5 feet and landed among the bodies he had created 20 minutes earlier. The smell hit him immediately. Blood and cordite and something else. The copper tang of death. McKinney ignored it. He had butchered hogs on the farm, had gutted deer in the Georgia heat. The smell of death was familiar. He moved quickly through the bodies, grabbed every bandolier he could find, every loose clip. He found 4 American ammunition pouches on men who had probably taken them as trophies. 64 more rounds. He stuffed the clips into his pockets and belt. A Japanese soldier appeared over the sandbag wall. He must have crawled forward while McKinney was gathering ammunition. The man's rifle was already coming up. McKinney shot him through the chest at 2 feet. He grabbed the dead man's grenades, 3 of them. Japanese Type 97 fragmentation grenades. He had never used one before, but he had seen them, knew how they worked. Pull the pin, strike the cap against something hard, count to 4, throw. Movement in his peripheral vision. More soldiers approaching from the left. McKinney armed a grenade, counted, and threw it over the sandbags. The explosion was followed by screaming. He armed the second grenade, threw it toward the tree line where muzzle flashes were concentrated. More screaming. He was out of the gun pit before the third grenade left his hand. Running again. A new position. Keep moving. The sky was light enough now to see clearly. McKinney found a shell crater 15 yards from his previous depression, dropped into it. The crater was 3 feet deep, enough cover to protect him from direct fire. He could see the entire approach from the jungle to the perimeter. Bodies littered the ground between his position and the trees. He counted quickly. 28, maybe 30. Some were still moving, wounded men trying to crawl back toward their lines. McKinney let them go. A wounded man required 2 healthy soldiers to carry him. Every casualty he created multiplied the enemy's problems. The mortar fire had stopped. McKinney understood why. The Japanese had lost visual contact with him. Their mortar crews could not adjust fire on a target they could not see. He had 15, maybe 20 minutes before they repositioned observers. He used the time to reload every empty clip he carried. His fingers worked automatically. Press the rounds into the clip. Feel for the spring tension. 8 rounds per clip. He had scavenged enough ammunition for approximately 10 reloads. 80 rounds. 80 rounds against however many Japanese soldiers were still in that jungle. The attack had lasted 23 minutes. McKinney had killed or wounded at least 30 enemy soldiers, but he knew the math was not in his favor. The Japanese had started with roughly 100 men. Even if half of them were down, that left 50, and he was still alone. Where was the rest of Company A? The answer was complicated. The Japanese attack had hit multiple points along the perimeter simultaneously. McKinney's position was on the northeast flank. Other soldiers were fighting their own battles on the south and west sides of the camp. The company commander was trying to organize a coherent defense, but in the darkness and chaos of a night attack, coordination was almost impossible. McKinney did not know any of this. He knew only that no one had come to help him. No reinforcements, no supporting fire. Just him, his rifle, and the bodies piling up in front of his position. The Japanese regrouped at the edge of the jungle. McKinney could see them through the trees. Soldiers checking weapons, NCOs moving among the ranks, an officer studying the American perimeter through binoculars. They had expected to overrun this outpost in 5 minutes. They had lost nearly a third of their force to 1 man in 23 minutes, and they still had not broken through. The officer lowered his binoculars. McKinney saw him gesture toward a specific section of the perimeter. Not the gun pit, not the craters where McKinney had been fighting. The officer was pointing at the supply tents. A different approach. A new axis of attack designed to bypass the killing ground McKinney had created. McKinney read the enemy's intention instantly. They were going to swing around his flank, hit the camp from a direction he could not cover, and there was nothing he could do to stop them from his current position. He had a choice: stay in his crater where he had cover and clear fields of fire, or move to intercept an attack he might not reach in time. McKinney climbed out of the crater and started running toward the supply tents. The supply tents were 40 yards from his crater. McKinney covered the distance in 8 seconds. He threw himself behind a stack of ammunition crates just as the first Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle on the southern approach. They had not expected him to be there. The lead element consisted of 12 soldiers moving in a tactical column. They were heading for the gap between 2 tents. Once through that gap, they would be inside the American perimeter with clear shots at soldiers fighting on other sections of the line. McKinney opened fire from behind the crates. The first 3 men in the column went down before the others could react. The 4th and 5th tried to return fire, but could not locate him in the shadows between the tents. McKinney shot them both. The remaining 7 scattered. Some ran back toward the jungle. Others dove for cover behind fallen logs and shallow depressions. McKinney tracked the ones who went to ground. They were pinned, unable to advance, unable to retreat without exposing themselves. He shifted his aim to the tree line. More soldiers were emerging. The Japanese commander had committed his reserve force to this flanking attack. 20 more men, maybe 25. They saw their comrades pinned down and hesitated at the edge of the jungle. That hesitation cost them. McKinney fired into the clustered soldiers. 8 rounds. Reload. 8 rounds. Bodies dropped among the trees. The survivors pulled back into deeper cover. 26 minutes into the attack, McKinney had now killed or wounded at least 35 enemy soldiers. The Japanese had tried 3 different approaches: frontal assault on the machine gun, mortar bombardment followed by infantry, flanking maneuver toward the supply area. All 3 had failed. The Japanese commander faced a problem he had never encountered. His intelligence had indicated this outpost was defended by a small American force with limited heavy weapons. Standard doctrine called for overwhelming night attacks against such positions. Speed and numbers would compensate for any defensive advantages, but one man had disrupted everything. The commander did not know it was one man. His soldiers reported heavy fire from multiple positions. They had seen muzzle flashes from the gun pit, then from a depression 30 yards away, then from behind the supply crates. It appeared the Americans had established interlocking fields of fire with several riflemen supporting each other. This assessment was wrong, but it shaped Japanese tactics for the next phase of the battle. The mortar crews repositioned to the southwest. They began dropping rounds on the supply area. McKinney heard the first impacts and moved immediately. He had learned. Static positions attracted mortar fire. Movement meant survival. He ran north along the inside of the perimeter, found a foxhole that had been abandoned when its occupant went to reinforce the southern defense, dropped into it. The hole was deeper than his previous positions, 4 feet down with a firing step that let him see over the lip. The Japanese infantry attacked again, this time from 2 directions simultaneously. One group from the south, another from the original northeastern approach. They were trying to split his fire, force him to choose which attack to engage. McKinney engaged both. He fired 4 rounds at the southern group, dropped 2 men, swung his rifle northeast, fired 4 rounds at that group, dropped 2 more. The M1 pinged empty. He reloaded in under 3 seconds, fired at the southern group again. The attack stalled. Neither group could advance into the withering rifle fire, but neither group retreated either. They went to ground and started returning fire. Bullets cracked over McKinney's head. Rounds thudded into the dirt around the foxhole. He was now taking fire from 2 directions. His ammunition was running low, and the Japanese were learning. They had figured out that the fire was coming from a single location. 1 rifleman. Not a squad, not interlocking positions, just 1 man who moved fast and shot accurately. This knowledge changed everything. The Japanese soldiers stopped attacking in waves. They began advancing individually. 1 man would move, while others provided covering fire. Then another man would move, leapfrogging forward, closing the distance yard by yard. It was a tactic designed to overwhelm a single defender. Even the best marksmen could not track multiple targets moving at different times from different directions. Eventually, someone would get close enough. McKinney recognized what they were doing. He had hunted animals that used similar tactics. A pack of coyotes would spread out and approach prey from multiple angles. The prey could only watch 1 threat at a time. The others would close in. He was the prey now. 31 minutes. The Japanese had closed to within 20 yards on the southern approach, 15 yards on the northeast. McKinney had fewer than 30 rounds remaining. The foxhole that had protected him was about to become his grave. McKinney did not wait for them to reach him. He burst out of the foxhole and charged directly at the nearest group of Japanese soldiers. 5 men were crouched behind a fallen palm tree 15 yards to the northeast. They had been waiting for their comrades to close from the other side. They did not expect their target to attack. McKinney shot the first man while still running, shot the second as he reached the log. The third soldier rose to meet him with a bayonet thrust. McKinney sidestepped and slammed his rifle butt into the man's face. Bone crunched. The soldier went down. The fourth man swung his rifle like a club. McKinney ducked under the blow and drove the steel butt plate of his M1 into the soldier's throat. The fifth man tried to run. McKinney shot him in the back at 3 yards. He kept moving, could not stop. Stopping meant death. The southern group had seen him leave the foxhole. They were sprinting toward his position. McKinney turned and fired. 2 men dropped. The others kept coming. He fired again. Another man fell. The M1 pinged empty. 3 Japanese soldiers reached him before he could reload. The first one tackled him around the waist. McKinney went down hard. His rifle flew from his hands. The second soldier stomped on his wounded ear. Pain exploded through his skull. The third raised the bayonet for a killing thrust. McKinney grabbed the ankle of the man standing on his head and twisted. The soldier lost his balance and fell. McKinney rolled, throwing off the man who had tackled him. The bayonet thrust missed his chest by inches and buried itself in the dirt. He scrambled to his knees, found his rifle, swung it in a wide arc that caught one soldier across the temple. The man collapsed. McKinney reversed the swing and drove the butt plate into another soldier's ribs. He felt bones break under the impact. The third soldier had pulled his bayonet from the ground. He lunged. McKinney blocked the thrust with his rifle barrel. The blade slid along the wood and steel, gouging a furrow in the stock. McKinney stepped inside the man's reach and headbutted him. The soldier staggered. McKinney hit him twice more with the rifle butt. He stopped moving. 33 minutes since the attack began. McKinney was breathing hard. His hands were slick with blood. Some of it was his own. His ear was a mass of torn flesh and dried gore. His uniform was ripped in a dozen places. He had bruises and cuts he did not remember receiving. But he was still alive. He looked around the battlefield. Bodies everywhere. Japanese soldiers who had come to kill Americans and found something they had not expected. More bodies than he could count in the gray morning light. Movement to his right. 2 more soldiers emerging from the jungle. McKinney raised his rifle and realized it was empty. He had not reloaded after the hand-to-hand fighting. The 2 soldiers saw him standing among the bodies of their comrades. They hesitated. McKinney charged them. He covered 10 yards before they could react. The first soldier tried to bring his rifle up. Too slow. McKinney's rifle butt caught him under the chin. The second soldier turned to run. McKinney chased him down in 3 strides and clubbed him from behind. 34 minutes. The mortar position. McKinney remembered seeing muzzle flashes from the southwest. The knee mortars had been pounding his positions throughout the battle. Taking out those crews would eliminate the indirect fire threat. He found a loaded rifle among the dead, an M1 with a full clip. Picked it up, dropped his damaged weapon, started moving toward the mortar position. The mortar crews saw him coming. 2 men. They had been adjusting their weapon for another fire mission. Now they scrambled to defend themselves. One reached for a rifle. The other tried to arm a grenade. McKinney shot them both from 45 yards. 35 minutes. He stood in the morning light, scanning the jungle for more targets. His chest heaved. His vision was blurring from exhaustion and blood loss. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest. The jungle was quiet. No more soldiers emerging from the trees. No more mortar rounds. No more rifle fire from concealed positions. Just the moans of wounded men and the buzzing of flies already gathering on the dead. McKinney walked back toward the American perimeter. He was halfway there when he saw figures moving toward him. American uniforms. Soldiers from Company A who had finally fought through to his section of the line. They stopped when they saw him, covered in blood, carrying a rifle that was not his own, surrounded by bodies. McKinney lowered his weapon. The reinforcements stared at the carnage around him, at the shattered machine gun position, at the scattered corpses stretching from the jungle to the perimeter. 36 minutes after Sergeant Fukutaro Mori had slashed open his tent, Private John McKinney was still standing, still breathing, still in complete control of the area. The battle was over, but no one yet understood what had actually happened. The soldiers who reached McKinney that morning were from 2nd Platoon. They had been fighting on the western edge of the perimeter when the Japanese attack hit. It took them 36 minutes to push through to McKinney's position. What they found defied comprehension. Bodies lay scattered across an area roughly 100 yards long and 60 yards wide. Japanese soldiers slumped over sandbags, crumpled in shell craters, sprawled among the supply crates, piled on top of each other near the damaged machine gun emplacement. The platoon sergeant ordered a count. His men moved through the battlefield, checking bodies, marking positions. The count took 20 minutes. When they finished, the sergeant did not believe the number. He ordered them to count again. 38 dead Japanese soldiers lay in the immediate vicinity of the machine gun position. 2 more bodies were found near the mortar emplacement, 45 yards away. 40 confirmed kills in a space that one man had defended for 36 minutes. The sergeant found McKinney sitting on an ammunition crate. The private was pressing a blood-soaked bandage against what remained of his right ear. His uniform was torn and stained. His rifle stock was cracked from repeated impacts against human skulls. He looked like a man who had walked through hell. The sergeant asked what had happened. McKinney gave a brief account. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. He spoke in short sentences. No embellishment, no drama, just facts. The sergeant did not believe him. No single soldier could kill 40 men in 36 minutes. It was impossible. There must have been other defenders, other riflemen supporting McKinney's position. The private was confused from blood loss and combat stress, but the other soldiers in Company A had been accounted for. The 2 men who originally manned the machine gun with McKinney had evacuated to the rear with wounds. Everyone else had been fighting on different sections of the perimeter. The ballistic evidence supported McKinney's account. Spent M1 casings littered the ground at exactly the positions he described. The trajectory of wounds on the Japanese bodies matched the firing angles from those positions. 1 man, 40 kills, 36 minutes. Company A's commanding officer forwarded a report to battalion headquarters. Battalion forwarded it to regiment. Regiment forwarded it to division. At each level, officers read the account and assumed it was exaggerated. Combat reports often inflated enemy casualties. Soldiers under stress made mistakes. The numbers had to be wrong. The 33rd Infantry Division sent an intelligence team to verify the report. They interviewed McKinney, interviewed witnesses, examined the battlefield, counted the bodies again. Some accounts suggested the actual number of Japanese dead exceeded 100, but only 40 could be directly attributed to McKinney's actions with certainty. The investigators reached an unavoidable conclusion. The report was accurate. Private John McKinney had single-handedly repelled an attack by approximately 100 Japanese soldiers. He had killed 40 of them. He had saved his company from potential annihilation. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor went forward in June 1945. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. Fewer than 3,500 have been awarded since the Civil War. The criteria are specific. The recipient must have distinguished himself conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. McKinney's actions exceeded those criteria by any reasonable measure. The recommendation moved through channels. War Department reviewers examined the evidence. They found the same thing the division investigators had found. The story was true. Every detail was supported by witness testimony and physical evidence. On January 23, 1946, Private John McKinney stood in the White House. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The citation described his actions in formal military language. Extreme gallantry, unsurpassed intrepidity, single-handedly thwarting an assault that threatened to annihilate his company. McKinney did not give speeches. He did not seek publicity. When reporters asked about the battle, he gave the same brief answers he had given the sergeant that morning on Luzon. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. The press called him the Pacific's Audie Murphy. Murphy had received his Medal of Honor for single-handedly holding off German forces in France. McKinney had done something similar against Japanese forces in the Philippines. Both men had faced overwhelming odds. Both had refused to retreat. Both had emerged victorious through a combination of skill, courage, and something that defied easy explanation. But while Murphy became a movie star after the war, McKinney went home to Georgia. He was 25 years old. He had a Medal of Honor, a third-grade education, and a partially severed ear that would never fully heal. The war was over. The killing was done. John McKinney had to figure out how to be a normal person again. John McKinney returned to Screven County, Georgia in 1946. He went back to the only life he knew, farming, hunting, fishing in the same creeks where he had learned to shoot as a boy. He rarely spoke about the war. Neighbors knew he had received the Medal of Honor. They had seen the newspaper articles. But McKinney never brought it up, never displayed the medal, never attended reunions or gave interviews. When people asked about Luzon, he would say a few words and then change the subject. The nightmares were a different matter. His family knew about those. the sounds he made in his sleep, the way he would wake suddenly, reaching for a rifle that was not there. The war had followed him home in ways that no medal could address. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized diagnosis in 1946. Soldiers who struggled with combat memories were told to forget about it, move on, be grateful they survived. McKinney did what most veterans of his generation did. He buried the memories and kept working. He married, raised a family, worked various jobs around Screven County. The years passed. Korea came and went. Vietnam came and went. New wars created new heroes and new veterans with their own buried memories. McKinney remained in Georgia, quietly living, quietly aging. The Medal of Honor sat in a drawer somewhere. He had earned the nation's highest military decoration, and most of his neighbors had no idea. In 1965, author Forrest Bryant Johnson began researching McKinney's story. Johnson was a veteran himself. He understood what McKinney had experienced. He spent years tracking down witnesses, examining military records, and piecing together the details of those 36 minutes on Luzon. The research was difficult. McKinney did not want to talk. Many of the witnesses had died. Military records were scattered across multiple archives. But Johnson persisted. He believed the story deserved to be told. His book, Phantom Warrior, was published in 2007. It documented McKinney's childhood in Georgia, his service in the Pacific, and the battle that earned him the Medal of Honor. The book brought renewed attention to a hero most Americans had never heard of. McKinney did not live to see the book published. He died on April 5, 1997, in Sylvania, Georgia. He was 76 years old. The sharecropper's son, who had killed 40 Japanese soldiers with a rifle in his bare hands, passed away quietly, surrounded by family. He was buried in Screven County, not far from the land where he had learned to hunt. 20 years after his death, Georgia honored him again. In 2017, the state legislature voted to rename a section of highway in Screven County. It became the John R. McKinney Medal of Honor Highway. A ceremony was held. Veterans attended. The McKinney family accepted the honor on behalf of a man who had never sought recognition for what he did. The highway sign stands today. Drivers pass it without knowing the story behind the name. They do not know about the tent and the sword. They do not know about the machine gun and the 36 minutes. They do not know that the quiet farmer who once lived nearby had saved an entire company through an act of violence and courage that still defies belief. 40 men in 36 minutes. One rifle. One soldier. One morning in the Philippines that should have ended in massacre, but ended in something else entirely. Private John McKinney never asked to be a hero. He was a farm boy who joined the army because there was a war. He did what he had to do to survive and to protect the men sleeping around him. Then he went home and tried to live a normal life. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is John McKinney. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about farm boys and privates who saved lives with rifles and bare hands. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure John McKinney does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen. At 11:03 a.m. on September 19, 1944, Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson crouched inside the turret of an M4 Sherman tank near Aricourt, France, watching his gunner prepare for an engagement they probably wouldn't survive. 24 years old, 4 months in combat, 12 tank battles. 0 times his gunner saw the enemy first. The Germans had 47 Panther tanks advancing. Thompson had been loading the 75mm gun for Sergeant William Crawford since June. Their survival depended on seeing German tanks first. But the Sherman's gunner sight was narrow. Crawford could only see 30 degrees. By the time the tank commander spotted a threat and Crawford traversed the turret, German gunners were aiming. The 4th Armored Division lost 23 Shermans in 3 weeks. The first loader Thompson lost was Corporal David Kozlowski. September 7th, Chicago, steel mill worker, trained together at Fort Knox. His Sherman took a Panther round at 1,300 yards. German gunner spotted them from a tree line. Aimed, fired. Shell penetrated the turret. Propellant charges ignited. Kozlowski was loading. Died instantly. His body stayed in the burning tank 3 hours. The second loader was Corporal James Martinez, September 16th, Thompson's best friend. Survived Normandy together. Talked about opening a garage after the war. Martinez's Sherman engaged 3 Panthers near Baisonge-la-Petite. Destroyed 1. A second Panther flanked them. Fired from 900 yards. Round went through the turret side. Martinez was pulling a shell. German round hit him directly. Killed instantly. Martinez's tank commander came to Thompson 2 days later. Said if they'd seen that Panther 3 seconds earlier, Martinez would still be alive. The officer was crying. By mid-September, Thompson had watched 11 loaders die. Every one because their gunner couldn't see threats fast enough. German tanks had better optics. American crews were brave, but you can't fight what you can't see. Thompson studied how engagements developed. Same pattern. German tank spotted Sherman first, took time to aim, fired accurately, hit first. Some crews survived, most didn't. The problem wasn't the gun. The 75mm could kill Panthers. The problem was seeing the target first. Crawford was good, but he could only see 30 degrees. Not enough. Thompson needed to give Crawford more eyes. See threats instantly, not after the commander called them. Right now. Every second was the difference between loading another shell and dying like Martinez. The solution came September 18th. Simple. A mirror from his shaving kit, 3 by 4 inches, standard issue. Mount it inside the turret. Crawford could see behind them without traversing, see flanking threats, see what the tank commander saw. Completely illegal. Modifying equipment without authorization meant court-martial, but Martinez was dead. Kozlowski was dead. 11 loaders dead. Thompson didn't want to be 12. He'd install the mirror tonight, test it tomorrow. Either Crawford would see threats faster, or Thompson would die trying. If this story is pulling you in, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about these forgotten heroes, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. These stories matter. The men who lived them deserve to be remembered. You're part of making that happen. Thompson worked alone that night. The maintenance area was quiet after 2,200 hours. Most crews had gone to sleep. Only sounds were distant generators and insects against overhead lights. The air smelled like engine oil. September nights in Lorraine were cool. Thompson could see his breath. He pulled his tool bag from under his bunk. Inside was the mirror from his shaving kit. 3 by 4 inches, metal frame, government issue. Also, wire cutters, pliers, steel wire salvaged from destroyed equipment, and a flashlight with a dying battery. The Sherman sat in the maintenance line 50 yards away. Thompson walked over. Boots crunched on gravel. Nobody challenged him. Night maintenance was common. Thompson climbing into his own tank wouldn't raise questions. He opened the loader's hatch. Climbed inside. The turret was cramped. Flashlight beam jumped across metal surfaces. Ammunition racks, the breech, the gunner's seat where Crawford would sit tomorrow. Thompson needed to mount the mirror where Crawford could see it without moving his head from the gun sight. The position had to be perfect. Too high, and Crawford couldn't see it while aiming. Too low, and it would block his movement. Thompson held the mirror in different positions. Testing. His hands were shaking. Not from cold. From knowing this could get him court-martialed. He settled on a position 12 inches left of Crawford's seat, mounted at 45 degrees. The mirror would reflect what was behind the tank. Anything approaching from rear or flanks. Crawford could glance at it without taking his eye off the main gun sight. 3-second check. Just enough to see if a Panther was flanking them. Thompson cut 4 6-inch pieces of steel wire. bent each into a U-shape. Mounting brackets. He drilled holes in the turret wall using a hand drill. The bit squealed against armor plate. Thompson stopped every few seconds. Listened. Made sure nobody was coming. Nobody came. Installing the brackets took 40 minutes. His fingers kept slipping. Flashlight kept rolling away. Twice he dropped the pliers. Each sound made his heart pound. If an officer found him modifying the tank, he'd face charges: destruction of government property, unauthorized modification, disobeying regulations. Minimum punishment was reduction in rank. Maximum was prison. But Martinez was dead. Kozlowski was dead. 11 loaders were dead. Tomorrow Thompson would either be loading shells or burning in this turret. The mirror might give them 3 seconds. 3 seconds to see a panther before it fired. 3 seconds to shoot first. 3 seconds to live. He secured the mirror to the brackets using wire. Twisted it tight. Tested the angle. The mirror showed the view behind perfectly. Thompson sat in Crawford's position. Looked through the main gun sight. Glanced left at the mirror. He could see both simultaneously. Main sight for targets ahead, mirror for threats behind. It worked. Thompson cleaned up. Wiped away metal shavings. The modification looked crude. Obviously not factory equipment, but functional. The turret was crowded with gear. Ammunition racks, radio sets, fire extinguishers. One small mirror might go unnoticed during inspection. He climbed out at 0130. Walked back to his bunk. Didn't sleep. Lay in the dark thinking about tomorrow. The 4th Armored Division was moving at 0700. Intelligence reported German Panthers in the area. 5th Panzer Army trying to stop Patton's advance. Tomorrow would be a tank battle. Either the mirror would work or it wouldn't. Either Crawford would see threats 3 seconds faster, or Thompson would die like his friends. No middle ground in tank combat. You shot first, or you burned. At 0615, Thompson heard engines starting. The battalion was preparing to move out. At 0712, Thompson's Sherman rolled out of the maintenance area. The engine rumbled. Tracks clanked against hard ground. Thompson sat in the loader's position, with 76 rounds of 75mm ammunition racked around him. Armor-piercing, high explosive, white phosphorus. He'd loaded these shells hundreds of times. Today might be the last time. Crawford was in the gunner's seat to Thompson's right. The tank commander stood in the cupola above them. The driver and assistant driver sat forward in the hull. 5 men in 30 tons of steel, rolling toward German positions 12 miles east. The battalion moved in column formation. 18 Shermans spread across 2 miles of French farmland, fields on both sides, tree lines in the distance, hills to the north. Perfect country for an ambush. The kind of terrain where Panthers hid and waited, where German gunners picked off American tanks one by one. Thompson watched Crawford. Crawford hadn't said anything about the mirror. Either he hadn't noticed it yet, or he was ignoring it. The mirror was mounted 12 inches to Crawford's left, angled at 45 degrees, reflecting the view behind the tank. Thompson had tested it last night. It worked, but combat would be the real test. At 0843, the radio crackled. Lead tank reported movement ahead. German armor. Panthers, maybe 6 of them. Range 2,000 yards, too far for accurate shooting. The battalion commander ordered the column to spread out. Find hull-down positions. Wait for the Germans to close the distance. Thompson's crew found a position behind a low ridge. The tank commander called out targets through the intercom. Crawford traversed the turret, searching. The main gun sight showed open farmland. No targets visible yet. The Germans were smart, using terrain, staying hidden until they had good shots. Thompson loaded an armor-piercing round, slammed the breech closed, tapped Crawford's shoulder. Ready. His heart was pounding, hands sweating. This was it. The moment that would prove whether the mirror worked, or whether Thompson had wasted his time drilling holes in government property for nothing. At 0907, Crawford fired. The gun recoiled. The breech opened. Hot brass casing ejected. Smoke filled the turret. Thompson grabbed another round. Loaded. The whole process took 6 seconds. Crawford was already traversing right, searching for the next target. Then Thompson heard Crawford's voice over the intercom. Calm, steady. Panther, left rear, 800 yards. Thompson's stomach dropped. Left rear meant flanking, meant a German tank had gotten around them, was coming at their side armor, the weakest part of the Sherman. A Panther round through the side would kill everyone. But Crawford had seen it. Without the tank commander calling it out, without traversing the turret to search, Crawford had glanced at the mirror, seen the Panther in the reflection, called it out immediately. The mirror worked. Crawford traversed left, fast. The turret whined. Thompson watched through the vision port, saw the Panther. It was moving across open ground, exposed. The German crew probably thought they were undetected, probably thought they had time to get into position, probably thought the Sherman hadn't seen them yet. They were wrong. Crawford fired. The round hit the Panther's left track, didn't penetrate the armor, but it stopped the German tank, immobilized it. The Panther tried to traverse its turret, tried to return fire. Crawford loaded another round faster than Thompson had ever seen, 7 seconds from first shot to second shot. The second round hit the Panther's turret side, penetrated. The German tank shuddered. Smoke poured from the hatches. The crew bailed out, running. The Panther was dead. Thompson had just watched Crawford kill a Panther that should have killed them. The German tank had flanked them perfectly, had gotten within 800 yards undetected, should have fired first, should have penetrated their side armor, should have killed Thompson and Crawford and everyone in the crew. But Crawford had seen it 3 seconds earlier because of the mirror. 3 seconds. That's all it took. 3 seconds to spot the threat, traverse the turret, fire first, win. The tank commander's voice came over the intercom, excited, asking how Crawford had seen that Panther so fast. Crawford said he'd glanced left, saw something in his peripheral vision. The tank commander didn't question it further, too busy directing them toward the next target. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. Thompson's crew destroyed 2 more Panthers. Other Shermans in the battalion got 3. German forces withdrew, left 7 burning Panthers behind. American losses were 2 Shermans, damaged, none destroyed, nobody killed. After the battle, Thompson's crew returned to the maintenance area. Crawford climbed out of the turret, found Thompson, looked at him for a long moment, then looked at the mirror mounted inside. Crawford reached out, touched it, tested the angle, saw how it reflected the view behind the tank. Crawford asked one question. "When did you install this?" Thompson told him. "Last night. Worked alone. Took 40 minutes. Completely illegal. Could get court-martialed if anyone found out. But Martinez was dead, and Thompson didn't want Crawford dying the same way." Crawford was quiet. Then he said something Thompson would remember for the rest of his life. "This saved us today. That Panther would have killed us if I hadn't seen it. I need you to do something for me." Thompson asked what. "Install one in every tank in the battalion." Thompson started with Crawford's wingman, Sergeant Robert Hayes. Hayes had lost his loader 3 weeks earlier, burned alive when a Panther hit them from the flank. Hayes survived with burns on his hands. His new loader was a replacement. Kid from Ohio, 18 years old, terrified. Thompson found Hayes that evening, told him about the mirror, showed him how it worked in Crawford's tank. Hayes looked at it, tested the angle, asked if Thompson could install one in his Sherman. Thompson said yes. Tonight. Don't tell anyone. They worked after 2,300 hours. Thompson brought his tools. Hayes kept watch. The installation took 35 minutes, faster than the first time. Thompson knew the exact position now, knew the angle, knew how to drill the holes without the bit squealing too loud. When they finished, Hayes tested it from the gunner's position, said it was perfect, said his gunner would be able to see flanking threats instantly. Hayes asked Thompson how much he wanted, payment for the work. Thompson said nothing. Just don't get killed. That's payment enough. The next day, Hayes' crew engaged 4 Panthers near Moncourt. Hayes' gunner spotted 2 of them using the mirror, called them out before they got into firing position, destroyed both. Hayes came back raving about the modification, told every tank commander in the company. By evening, 6 more crews wanted mirrors. Thompson installed 3 more that night, 2 the night after. Word spread through the battalion faster than Thompson expected. Loaders talked to other loaders. Gunners talked to other gunners. Tank commanders started asking their crews if they'd heard about the mirror modification. Some crews were skeptical. Most wanted it immediately. By September 25th, Thompson had installed mirrors in 14 Shermans. He was exhausted, working maintenance during the day, installing mirrors at night, getting maybe 4 hours of sleep. But crews were surviving. The battalion's kill ratio had shifted. 5 Panthers destroyed for every Sherman lost. That ratio had been reversed a month ago. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the battalion. Abrams was a tanker's tanker. Aggressive, smart, knew armor combat inside and out. He noticed something was different. His crews were spotting German tanks faster, reacting quicker, winning engagements they should have lost. But he couldn't figure out what had changed. On September 27th, Abrams did an inspection of the tank line. Standard procedure, checking maintenance, verifying ammunition loads, ensuring equipment was combat ready. He climbed into Thompson's Sherman, looked around the turret. His eyes stopped on the mirror mounted to the left of the gunner's seat. Abrams asked what that was. Thompson's stomach dropped. This was it. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison. Everything he'd feared since installing the first mirror. Crawford spoke up before Thompson could answer. Said it was a modification they'd made. Helped the gunners see threats from the flanks. Had saved their lives twice in the past week. Abrams asked who authorized it. Crawford said nobody. They'd done it themselves. Knew it was against regulations, but it worked. Abrams stared at the mirror for a long time. Then he climbed out of the turret, walked down the line, climbed into Hayes's tank, saw another mirror, same position, same angle. Climbed into a third tank, another mirror. Abrams realized what was happening. Multiple tanks had been modified, all the same way, all without authorization. He called Thompson over, asked him directly, "Did you install these mirrors?" Thompson said, "Yes, sir, all of them. 14 tanks total. Took about 40 minutes per tank. Used salvaged materials. No requisitions, no paperwork. Completely illegal." Thompson stood at attention, waited for Abrams to order his arrest. Abrams asked how many tanks in the battalion didn't have mirrors yet. Thompson said 23, sir. Abrams looked at him, then said something Thompson never expected. "You have 48 hours to install mirrors in every tank in this battalion. That's an order. I'll handle the paperwork. You focus on keeping my crews alive." Thompson stood there, stunned. Abrams had just officially authorized the modification, made it legal, protected Thompson from court-martial. More than that, Abrams understood what the mirrors meant, understood they were saving lives, and he was willing to break regulations to save more. That night, Thompson worked faster than ever. He recruited other mechanics, showed them how to install the mirrors, taught them the position, the angle, the drilling technique. By September 29th, every Sherman in the battalion had a mirror. The modification was no longer a secret. It was standard equipment. The Battle of Araucourt started on September 19th and lasted 2 weeks. 4th Armored Division faced elements of 5th Panzer Army, 47 German Panthers and Panzer IVs against American Shermans. The Germans had better tanks, better guns, better armor, but they lost. American tankers destroyed over 60 German tanks, lost 18 Shermans. The kill ratio stunned German commanders. They'd been fighting Shermans for months, knew how to kill them, knew their weaknesses. But something had changed. American tanks were spotting German flanking maneuvers faster, reacting quicker, shooting first. German after-action reports mentioned unusual American tactics. Shermans were engaging targets they shouldn't have been able to see, reversing before German tanks could get into firing position. It was like American gunners had eyes in the back of their heads. They did. Simple 3x4-inch mirrors, By early October, word about the modification had spread beyond 4th Armored Division. Tank crews talked to other tank crews during resupply operations. Mechanics shared techniques. A crew chief from 6th Armored Division saw the mirrors during a visit to 4th Armored's maintenance area. Asked Thompson how to install them. Thompson showed him. 2 days later, 6th Armored started installing mirrors in their Shermans. Then 10th Armored Division heard about it. Then 3rd Armored. The modification spread battalion to battalion, division to division. No official orders, no engineering directives. Just mechanics installing mirrors because they worked, because crews were surviving. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams wrote a report to 3rd Army Headquarters, described the mirror modification, included combat statistics. Before mirrors, 4th Armored was losing 2 Shermans for every German tank destroyed. After mirrors, they were destroying 3 German tanks for every Sherman lost. The difference was undeniable. The mirrors gave American gunners a tactical advantage that offset German superiority in armor and guns. General George Patton read the report. Patton commanded 3rd Army. He understood armor combat, understood that tank battles were decided by whoever shot first. The mirror modification gave American crews a few extra seconds. In tank combat, seconds meant everything. Patton ordered the modification installed in every Sherman in 3rd Army, not as a suggestion, as a direct order. Maintenance crews across the entire army began installing mirrors, using whatever materials they could find, salvaged metal, wire, even glass from broken windows. The mirrors didn't need to be fancy. They just needed to reflect. By October 15th, over 300 Shermans in Europe had mirrors. The modification had spread from one loader's desperate attempt to save his crew to an army-wide tactical advantage, and it had happened in less than a month. German intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined destroyed American tanks, found the mirrors, didn't understand their significance at first, thought they were personal items, shaving mirrors. It took several weeks before German analysts realized the mirrors were positioned specifically for the gunner to see behind the tank. By then it was too late. The modification had already spread throughout American armor units. German tactics that relied on flanking maneuvers were failing. Panthers that used to kill Shermans from the side were being spotted and destroyed before they could fire. The tactical advantage Germans had enjoyed for months was disappearing. German tankers started avoiding engagements with American Shermans unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority. The Panther was still the better tank, still had better armor and a better gun, but the Americans could see them coming. And in tank combat, seeing the enemy first mattered more than having the better weapon. Thompson had installed the first mirror to save Crawford. Now that mirror had saved hundreds of American tank crews. Men who would have died in flanking attacks were surviving. Going home. The modification cost nothing, required no new equipment, no factory production, just a small mirror and 40 minutes of work. But the Army wanted to make it official. In November 1944, an engineering team from Ordnance Department arrived at 4th Armored Division headquarters. 3 officers, 2 civilian engineers. They'd been sent to evaluate the mirror modification, determine if it should be integrated into standard Sherman production, make it official Army equipment instead of field improvisation. The team spent 3 days inspecting tanks, interviewing crews, testing the mirrors in combat simulations. They measured angles, calculated sight lines, verified that the modification didn't interfere with turret operations. Their conclusion was unanimous. The mirrors worked. They should have been part of the original design. The Ordnance Department recommended that all new Shermans rolling off production lines be fitted with mirrors in the gunner's position. Existing tanks in theater should be retrofitted during maintenance cycles. The modification would become official equipment. Standard issue. No longer illegal. But there was a problem. The engineers wanted to redesign the installation, make it cleaner, more professional, use manufactured brackets instead of bent wire, use regulation mirrors instead of salvaged shaving mirrors. They wanted to take Thompson's improvised solution and turn it into proper military equipment. Thompson didn't care about that. He cared that the engineers wanted credit. They were writing reports, submitting patents, claiming the mirror system as an Ordnance Department innovation. Thompson's name appeared nowhere in the documentation. Neither did Crawford's. Neither did Hayes's. The official record would show that Army engineers had developed an improved sighting system for Sherman tanks. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams tried to correct this. He wrote letters, submitted reports, made sure Thompson's name was in every document from 4th Armored Division. But those reports got buried, lost in the bureaucracy. The engineering team's version became the official story. Army engineers had identified a problem with Sherman gunner visibility and developed a solution. Thompson learned about this in December. An officer showed him the official documentation, asked if he wanted to file a complaint. Thompson said no. He didn't care about credit, didn't care about recognition. He cared that crews were surviving, that loaders weren't burning alive because their gunners couldn't see threats. If the Army wanted to pretend engineers invented the mirrors, fine, as long as they installed them. By January 1945, the modification was standard across all American armor units in Europe. Over 800 Shermans had mirrors. Production lines in the United States started including them in new tanks. The system was official, approved, no longer a field improvisation. Thompson continued loading for Crawford. They fought through the Battle of the Bulge, pushed into Germany, survived engagements that would have killed them 6 months earlier. The mirror saved them 4 more times. Each time, Crawford spotted a German tank trying to flank them. Each time, they fired first. Each time, Thompson stayed alive. Other crews had similar stories. Loaders who would have died in December were still alive in January, still alive in February, still fighting. The mirrors had become so common that new crews didn't realize they were originally unauthorized modifications. They thought the mirrors were factory equipment, standard Sherman design. Only the older crews knew the truth, knew that a desperate loader had installed the first mirror in September, knew that the modification had spread crew to crew, mechanic to mechanic, battalion to battalion, knew that it had saved hundreds of lives before the Army made it official. Thompson's work had changed how American tanks fought, but his name never appeared in any citation. No commendation, no medal, no official recognition. The engineering team took the credit. The Army accepted their version. And Thompson went back to loading shells. He'd saved Crawford, saved Hayes, saved hundreds of other tank crews. That was enough. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Thompson's crew was in Czechoslovakia when Germany surrendered. They'd fought for 11 months, survived dozens of engagements. The mirror had saved them 8 times. 8 times Crawford spotted German tanks trying to flank them. 8 times they fired first. 8 times Thompson kept loading instead of burning. Crawford survived the war. 63 combat engagements, 14 confirmed tank kills. He returned to Detroit in August 1945. Went back to factory work, got married, had 3 kids. He kept the photograph of his Sherman crew on his desk for 40 years. Thompson was in that photograph, standing next to the tank. Young, thin, covered in grease. Crawford never forgot what Thompson had done. Every year on September 19th, Crawford called Thompson, thanked him for installing the mirror, told him he wouldn't have survived without it. Thompson always said the same thing. He was just doing his job, keeping his crew alive. That's what loaders do. Thompson stayed in the Army until 1946, then went home to Pennsylvania, small town outside Pittsburgh. He worked in a steel mill for 32 years, same work he'd done before the war. Hot metal, heavy machinery, long shifts. He married in 1948, had 2 daughters, lived a quiet life. Thompson never talked about the mirror. When people asked about the war, he said he was a loader, worked on tank crews. That's all. He didn't mention the modification, didn't mention saving hundreds of lives, didn't mention that he'd changed how American tanks fought. It wasn't modesty. He just didn't think it mattered anymore. Hayes also survived, the gunner who'd lost his first loader. Hayes fought until Germany surrendered, never lost another crew member. He credited the Mirror with saving his crew 3 times. After the war, Hayes became a high school teacher in Ohio, taught history. Sometimes he'd tell his students about tank combat, about how small innovations could save lives. He never mentioned Thompson by name, didn't know if Thompson wanted the attention. By the 1960s, the Mirror modification had been forgotten. New tanks had better optics, better sighting systems, better everything. The Sherman was obsolete. Museums displayed them, veterans looked at them, but nobody remembered that hundreds of Shermans in Europe had crude mirrors mounted inside their turrets. Nobody remembered that a desperate loader had installed the first one in September 1944. The official Army history of armor development never mentioned Thompson. The engineering reports credited Ordnance Department innovations. The patents belonged to civilian contractors. Thompson's contribution had been erased from the record. Not intentionally, just through bureaucratic process. Field modifications weren't historically significant. Official engineering developments were. Thompson retired from the steel mill in 1978. Spent his retirement working in his garage, fixing cars, small engines. Same kind of work he'd done in the Army. His daughters knew he'd served in the war, knew he'd been a tank crewman, didn't know anything about mirrors. In 1992, a military historian researching Sherman modifications found references to improvised mirrors in maintenance logs from 4th Armored Division. The logs mentioned a Staff Sergeant Thompson. The historian spent 6 months tracking down veterans from that unit. Found Crawford. Crawford told him the whole story. About Martinez dying, about Thompson installing the mirror, about how it spread through the entire division. The historian found Thompson through veteran registries. Thompson was 74 years old, still living in Pennsylvania, still working part-time in his garage. The historian asked if he'd installed the mirrors. Thompson said yes. Asked why the historian cared about something that happened 50 years ago. The historian said he'd found maintenance logs from over 40 battalions, estimated that somewhere between 600 and 800 Sherman tanks had mirrors installed between September 1944 and May 1945. Based on survival rate improvements in units that used the mirrors versus units that didn't, the modification had probably saved between 200 and 300 American tank crew lives. Thompson said he'd never counted. He just remembered Crawford, and Hayes, and the others who came back. That was enough. The historian published his findings in 1994. A small article in a military history journal described the mirror modification, credited Thompson, included interviews with Crawford and Hayes. The article reached maybe 2,000 readers, mostly academics, veterans, history enthusiasts. Thompson received 3 letters after the article published. One from a former tank commander who'd used the mirror in Germany, said it had saved his crew twice. One from a loader who'd installed mirrors in 6th Armored Division, said he'd learned the technique from Thompson's crew chief. One from a museum curator asking if Thompson would donate his tools or any materials from the war. Thompson had nothing to donate. He'd left everything in Europe. Came home with his duffel bag and discharge papers. That's all. No souvenirs, no memorabilia. Just memories of Martinez and Kozlowski and the 11 others who died before Thompson figured out how to keep Crawford alive. Crawford visited Thompson in 1996, drove from Detroit to Pennsylvania. They hadn't seen each other in 40 years, talked for 6 hours, about the war, about the mirror, about the crews they'd lost and the crews they'd saved. Crawford said he'd tried for years to get Thompson recognized, written letters to the Army, to veterans organizations. Nobody cared. Too much time had passed. Too many bigger stories from the war. Thompson said he didn't need recognition. He had Crawford sitting in his garage, alive. That's recognition enough. Frank Thompson died on March 14, 2003. He was 84 years old. Heart failure. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in World War II as a tank crewman with 4th Armored Division. It did not mention the mirror modification. Did not mention that he'd saved hundreds of lives. Did not mention that he'd changed how American armor fought in Europe. His funeral was small. Family, a few friends. 3 men Thompson didn't know attended. They introduced themselves after the service. Tank veterans. Men whose crews had used the mirror modification. They'd read about Thompson's death in veterans' newsletters, wanted to pay respects, wanted his family to know what he'd done. Thompson's daughters learned the full story that day. Learned their father had installed mirrors in tanks. Learned those mirrors had saved lives. Learned he'd done it without authorization.